Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this Energy Forum. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Tim Thompson. I am the CEO at Lake Region Electric Cooperative. And on behalf of all of the Lake Region Electric Cooperative board members and Lake Region Electric Cooperative employees who are here, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our Energy Forum. As we all know, our energy industry is changing rapidly. Because of this, our strategy at Lake Region Electric Cooperative is to do more for our members. In addition to providing safe, reliable, and affordable electricity, we are striving to be your local trusted energy services provider, offering a menu of energy services. Here's some of the examples of the energy services that we now provide. We have started a natural gas company to bring natural gas service to areas in our service territory that's never had gas before. We are improving the quality of life of the people that we are serving because it's a lower cost fuel compared to propane, and we are saving them money on their heating costs. We now have a standby generator business where we will install and maintain standby generators for our members. For those members who are worried about power outages and storms and those types of things, this is a good option to have a standby generator that will automatically come on when the power goes out and power your home for you. We install ground-mounted solar systems called our Go West solar solution for members. We've done 2 successful community solar projects with our members, and we've also done a first-of-its-kind wind-solar hybrid project where we are harnessing both the wind and the sun in one local renewable energy project and providing that renewable energy to our members. As the industry continues to change and evolve, we also want to do more to increase our member engagement and strive to be your local trusted source of information. We want to be a cooperative that has a high level of member engagement. The map on this slide with all those dots on it, that's our electric service territory. It's a large service territory. It's 3,200 square miles. Each one of those dots represents some form of member engagement that we've had across our big service territory in the last couple of years. Things like our annual meeting, our district meetings, our Coffee with the Co-op program, where we get out into the neighborhoods, invite members in to have a cup of coffee and a donut with us and talk about Lake Region, talk about energy issues. It includes our Apps and Chats program, again, where we get out into the neighborhoods at a restaurant, invite members in to have an appetizer and a beverage and just talk about energy issues and Lake Region Electric. It also represents the locations where the members live who participate in our virtual member advisory committee. I know some of you are here today. That's great. With the magic of technology, we can communicate, share information with those members, receive feedback from them. Just a great way to increase our member engagement. Well, what better way to increase our member engagement at Lake Region than to have an energy forum with the room full of Lake Region members, board members, and employees, and an absolutely wonderful lineup of panelists today. We are just delighted to have these experts in the room with us. We so much appreciate you being here. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce our moderator and our panelists. I hope you've got an agenda with you. If you don't, raise your hand. We will get one to you. Within this pamphlet is also the bios of our moderator and our panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce them and give an overview, and then I will turn it over to our moderator. So let's start with our moderator right here to my left, Jeff Haas. Jeff is the manager of member services and energy use, end-use strategy for Great River Energy, or GRE, as we say. Jeff works closely with us on important topics like load management, a very important aspect to Lake Region Electric, considering we have over half of our members participating in at least one load management program. Great River Energy is our generation and transmission cooperative, and Lake Region is one of the member owners of Great River Energy. Great River Energy manages the generation of the electricity and the transmission lines to transport the electricity to our substations at the local level, and Lake Region distributes the energy from there to you at the local level. Our first presenter today, next to Jeff there, is Derek Moe. Derek is the CEO of Minnesota Rural Electric Association, or MREA. MREA provides valuable leadership to Minnesota cooperatives on key topics like energy policy, legislative affairs, regulatory affairs, our safety culture, which is so important to us at Lake Region, as well as education and training opportunities for our board members and employees. And while Derek is going to be discussing a lot of things today, he's going to be talking about the new Minnesota carbon-free standard. We are very thankful to Derek and MREA and his team for the efforts in this last legislative session to achieve some amendments for us in that important legislation. Following Derek will be Priti Patel. With Priti's busy schedule today, she is joining us virtually. When we get to her part of the presentation, she will appear on the screen for us. Priti is the Vice President and Chief Transmission Officer with Great River Energy. We really appreciate her leadership on critical topics like the significant transmission infrastructure build-out that she will be speaking about, additional transmission infrastructure that is needed to improve reliability on the grid. Following Priti will be Zach Ruziski. He is the Director of Resource Planning at Great River Energy. Zach, for those of you who were at our annual meeting, attended our annual meeting a month ago. Zach and his team have done a great job managing the generation portfolio at GRE as it has transitioned from a predominantly coal-dominated portfolio to a more renewable-based portfolio. He will be speaking about Great River Energy's 15-year IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, that shows what resources our future power supply will come from. Following Zach is Tolu Omotoso. Tolu is the Director of Energy Solutions for our national association, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, NRECA. He is one of NREC's subject matter experts on distributed energy resources like battery storage and microgrids. He will be speaking on a variety of topics from industry trends to the utility member of the future. Rounding out our distinguished panelists here is Julie Lucas. We are just delighted that Julie could be here today. She is the Executive Director of Mining Minnesota. Julie advocates for responsible mining of the mineral resources that will be needed to keep the lights on as our industry transitions to a future power in greater part from renewables. You know, it seems daily that in the daily industry news clips, we hear something about mining and minerals, and just delighted that you're here. Great timing for our forum. These panelists are incredibly busy people. As I hand it off to Jeff, our moderator, would you please join me and let's give them a very warm welcome and just look forward to a very learning opportunity today and some engagement. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thank all of you for being here today. I think this is going to be a really great forum, a great opportunity, as Tim mentioned, for engagement and dialogue, and to hear from us on some of the thoughts that we all have related to this energy transition that we're all experiencing. Tim mentioned some of the things that we're seeing every day in the news around energy, around mining. It's a time of tremendously rapid change, and we're seeing a lot of increased interest in this industry overall. We see it at the legislature in Minnesota, we see it at the federal level, we see it in the way that members and end-use consumers are engaging and looking at new technologies, electric vehicles, storage, other types of energy uses that are coming available and becoming more commercially available for us. And it really does take a partnership across numerous organizations, and this is a handful of the organizations that we have here that we work closely with through Great River Energy and through our member-owner distribution co-ops. Great River Energy, Tim mentioned, is the wholesale generation and transmission provider for 27 member-owner distribution cooperatives, Lake Region being one of them. We're really proud to be able to serve Lake Region, and the other 26 member owners and the 1.7 million Minnesotans and Wisconsinites that use the power that we're generating and transmitting across our system. Today, we're going to start with Derek Moe, as Tim mentioned. And the way that we intend for this to play out is we'll have each presenter go through their presentation, open it up for a few questions to ask the individual presenters following their presentation, and then move on and through it. My challenge, my job here today is to keep things on time and to make sure that the questions that are being asked or that you have are being put to the right subject matter experts up here. And then finally, at the end of the panelists, we'll have about 35 minutes for open Q&A with all of the panelists, and we hope to get a lot of engagement and questions from you. That is ultimately the objective here, is for this to be a forum for you to ask the subject matter experts that we have up here, the panelists, what's on your mind? What thoughts do you have? What questions do you have? And so thank you for being here. This is going to be a really great event. I'm privileged to be able to have this opportunity to work with everyone on this panel and to be here with you today. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Derek.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Tim and Lake Region. It's great to have an opportunity to be with you all this morning. Talk about these important issues, have a chance to dialogue, kind of talk about in an informative way what's going on in the industry today. And as was already alluded to, there is so much going on in the industry, and I'm going to specifically try to talk about the 2040 legislation, which is definitely a huge example of the change that's going on in our industry, a big example of legislation here in Minnesota that we've been working on with our membership at MREA. I'm going to talk about that a little bit and then try to talk about how that intersects, especially with a couple of our key priorities as cooperatives. That is making sure that we can keep the lights on every time you reach for the switch, that we keep the system reliable, and that we keep electricity as affordable as possible. So how does this big change, and especially this big 2040 legislation, intersect with those priorities of reliability and affordability? And it's great to be here in a forum where we can bring the community together, just kind of share what we know about these things and what the questions are about these things, because there's certainly a lot of questions, and be able to engage with member owners. That's what co-ops are all about, is working in their communities, and it's a great opportunity to be part of that with you here this morning. So Minnesota Rural Electric Association is the statewide association for all the rural electric cooperatives in the state. There are 50 of them. Only Texas has more rural electric co-ops. Of course, we don't want to be bigger than Texas, so they're all members of ours. 85% of the land mass in the state is served by rural electric co-ops at 1.7 million Minnesotans. About a third of the population of the state is served by rural electric co-ops. We worked on the 2040 legislation on behalf of the co-ops, and the legislature is wrapping up its session as we speak. And so we've been very active working on energy policy issues across the legislative session at MREA with our membership. We do other things as well. Safety is a huge priority. That was mentioned this morning, communication and education. So it's a great opportunity to work with our membership on a number of areas. And specifically wanted to share the work we've been doing and what's been happening at the legislature this session on the 2040 bill. How many people have heard of the 2040 bill? Yeah. I would expect most of you have. I would say it's the biggest piece of energy legislation that the state has ever passed. Huge piece of energy legislation. Passed in about 1 month, the first month of the legislative session. But it's not that they first came up with the idea when they went to St. Paul this year. This actually had been passed in essentially the same form in a prior legislative session. So they came into the session knowing what they wanted to pass. The House had passed it in the same form. It didn't pass in the Senate in prior sessions. But the Senate, either the people in the Senate had already advocated for it in prior sessions, or the new senators that were coming into the Senate to provide a majority for the DFL had ran on the platform. So this was the second key vote. Abortion was first. This was the second key vote in the session where they held their caucus together for the DFL and passed this piece of legislation. So it passed within a month of the legislature coming into session, roughly a month. The governor signed it on February 7th. And they have made good on this effort in the legislature to pass these key priorities by a caucus vote. And that was kind of what they set out to do, and we've seen that happen pretty much as they set out to do it. And 2040 was one of the first key examples of that, where you had party line vote and it passed in both houses and signed by the governor by the 7th of February 2023. And what it does essentially, in one sentence, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what this means, but it requires that by 2040, all electricity that you purchase in the state of Minnesota, it's not focused on the generation source, it's focused on purchases, will be carbon-free. It also sets interim targets. It's not just that you get there by 2040, which is soon in the electric utility business, but it also says by 2030 you have to be at this point, by 2035 you have to be at this point, and by 2040 you have to be carbon-free. And in addition to carbon-free, it also reinforces and increases our renewable energy standard. We've had a RES, or a renewable energy standard, in the state since 2007. To say that we had to be at least 25% wind and solar, essentially, from a concept standpoint. Those renewable energy standard numbers were also increased into the future as part of this bill. Now, it's important to note that we were already rapidly decarbonizing as a state prior to this bill passing. This is a path that is not new for Minnesota. It's not new for the nation, certainly not new for Minnesota. Within about a year prior to this passing, within the last 18 months, say, what utilities have filed at the Public Utilities Commission showing what their generation portfolios were going to look like in the future showed that even prior to the passage of this bill, by 2032, all utilities in Minnesota as a whole would be 70% carbon-free by 2032. So it was a path that we were already going down rapidly as a state. This certainly accelerates it and puts some mandates in place to make sure that that continues to happen. Great River Energy is an example of, co-ops are already leading in this transition. Great River Energy, for example, which is where Lake Region Electric Cooperative gets their wholesale power from, and they're going to speak to us about their future plans now in light of the 2040 bill in a little bit. But even before this, they were committed to an 80% reduction by 2032 of carbon. So co-ops were already leading in this path to transition to renewable energy. But by passing this bill, Minnesota is not unique, okay? This is not something that no one else in the nation is doing. In fact, 21 states and territories have already acted on kind of similar concepts. So I want to be clear that this is not just something that Minnesota has baked up and no one else is doing. But the other thing that's worthy to note is by passing this bill a few months ago, we have now jumped pretty far into the lead, if you will, on the aggressiveness of what this standard establishes. So the District of Columbia and Rhode Island, both really big, a lot of our resources come from those two areas. They're still ahead of us in terms of the timing required, but we're now tied with New York for either first, depending on how you think about District of Columbia and Rhode Island, or third, and again, kind of tied with New York in terms of the aggressiveness of the standard that's been established by this bill. And of those 21, roughly half of those, as the slide shows, are goals. So they've set things that are actually not required by law. And to be clear, the 2040 mandate in Minnesota now is not a goal. We sort of had similar goals essentially in the state already prior to this bill, but this bill now makes it a mandate that we have to get to these levels by 2040. And at California, in the energy, if you follow energy policy very much, you probably hear about California a lot. It's one of the states that's pointed to as doing a lot of these pretty aggressive policies. They, for example, are 2045 as a standard to get. So what does carbon-free mean? One of the things that I want to try to make clear, this is a very complex topic, of course, in general. One of the things that's interesting and hard about this is how complex it is. But specifically, kind of what it means is your generation portfolio has to change. And so this slide tries to unpack at a high level for the state. What does the generation portfolio changing mean? Where are we at basically now? 2019 is a year where we have complete set of annual data, so that's essentially a recent snapshot. And where do we have to get to by 2040 in order to achieve this mandate? So you can see, hopefully you can read those colors fairly well on the map there, that 25% is coal in 2019. So coal has to go away by 2040. And the specific links at the bottom of this slide, or if you search MISO, I'm going to talk about MISO and their reliability concerns in a moment, but if you search MISO, you can actually see any particular moment of the day what our generation resource portfolio looks like right now, because they're tracking that in real time. It often looks pretty similar to this 2019 total. So you got to get the coal to zero, you got to get natural gas to zero. Again, that's a significant part of this slide of the 17.5%. Wind and solar obviously have to increase significantly in order to meet this standard by 2040. Hydropower is considered carbon-free in the bill. It actually wasn't considered carbon-free prior to this legislation, but it is now. But hydropower is not a resource where we're going to build a whole bunch of new hydropower, of course. There can be no new nuclear, not because nuclear is not considered carbon-free. It is. There's no emissions from nuclear power. But there's a separate moratorium on new nuclear power in the state that didn't get changed in this legislation. So one of the things about generation resource mix, not for co-ops, because we don't have any nuclear power plants, but Xcel, it was very important to them that they preserve their existing nuclear as long as possible. So nuclear will continue to be part of the mix for a while. They'll continue to try to extend the licensing for their existing nuclear plants. And there's some work going on, possibly a study in this legislative session, to think about whether nuclear might be a part of the resource mix in terms of new sources at some point. But right now in Minnesota, there's a moratorium on that. Innovation is required. Okay, so this is the two kind of major themes here are, here's a little bit specifically about how the generation resource has to shift, and the other major theme is you certainly have to increase wind and solar a lot, but you also have to do some innovation to figure out how you're really going to get there and keep the system reliable and affordable in the 2040 timeframe, because because there's a lot of generation that has to be available, and you have to make sure that it's there all the time and reliable. And another key thing to understand about this is the generation portfolio is not just sort of a sideshow in the electric utility industry. We're a very capital-intensive industry, so we spend a lot on infrastructure in order to get electricity to you, and roughly 60% of everything you spend on electricity goes to feed generation sources, goes to pay for generation sources, roughly 60 cents of every dollar. That's not a Lake Region specific statistic, but nationally as a rough rule of thumb, 60% of all the dollars we spend as an industry go to take care of these generations. So this is a monumental change because 60% of everything you spend has to shift from what's on the left to the bullets on the right by 2040. We're concerned about reliability as rural electric co-ops. It's a huge priority for us that when you reach for the lights, they come on every single time. And another key concept to understand about the industry is one of the things that makes this hard and complex is when you turn on the lights, we have to adjust generation then. Electricity moves at the speed of light. It's known as the most complex machine known to man, the North American electric grid. And when you make a change in load, when you turn on your heat, turn on your lights, the generation has to change at that time because we don't store generation on the electric grid. And so we have to have resources available to adjust real time all the time. We don't store it like you would in a water system, perhaps. It's a very fast-moving, complex system. Now, energy storage is a new thing we need to do more innovation on. So I say we don't store energy. Of course, that's not true. We do have batteries out there now, and that's a big thing in the industry. The problem is that for short-term battery storage, there's quite a bit of that going on in the industry, but it's still very expensive. So when it comes to affordability, we have to figure out how to make it more affordable. And for long-term energy storage, if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and it's very cold for days at a time, you essentially don't have that available. Great River Energy is a very innovative company in that area. They're working on a small pilot for a long-term energy storage. That's something we need to continue to innovate in, because right now it's not available to really be able to fix this gap. So we need to be careful about shutting down gas and coal before we have adequate other resources available. Shutting them down prematurely is a risk to reliability, and we're concerned about that as rural electric co-ops. We're concerned about that as an industry. There are both economic and policy pressures that are already leading to reliability concerns, and we're concerned about dealing with this transition in a way that makes sure that reliability is retained as we go through this transition. And so this slide just gets a little more color on when I say we're concerned about that. I've been in the industry about 35 years now as a utility guy, but it's not just me that's concerned, okay? These are the people, these are not advocacy groups that I'm talking about here. These are the people that are responsible for keeping the lights on across the electric grid. And they are concerned about lights not being on all the time. So the Mid-Continent MISO, for example, at the top there, I said you could look real time at what the generation mix is across the grid right now for MISO, because they're the ones keeping track of that. They're not advocating for energy policy. What they're doing is trying across a 15-state area roughly to keep the lights on. They have warned recently that in order to get to a low-carbon future, what we need now is more gas, not less, because gas is adjustable and you can call on it when you need it. And in the short run, we need more of that to make sure the electric grid is reliable. NERC, which on a national level sets the standards for reliability, similar warnings. They warned in their in December of 2022 that more resources are needed, and specifically for MISO in this region, we have 1,300 megawatt shortfall in capacity during peak load conditions, and then it's an accelerating trend. Yesterday, NERC came out with their latest assessment, and this problem has percolated even more broadly across the country. So essentially, they're again saying, we're concerned about reliability and over a broad area. Now, they clarify that if the weather's good, we're fine. So usually the weather's good here, so I shouldn't be a problem. FERC, who is another regulator in this area, actually sets the standards with NERC, recently said at a conference, this is the FERC commissioner about reliability, that the U.S. is heading to a very catastrophic situation in terms of reliability. So this is not to say that Tim and I are worried about reliability. This is to say we have a real challenge in the industry here to adopt new policy mandates and keep the lights on all the time. And unfortunately, I'm not here to tell you the job's easy and we have the answer. I'm here to tell you we're going to have to be working hard on this in the next several years to make these priorities come together as well as we can in this environment. And there will be some more good news. I mean, again, Great River Energy, Lake Region, has been on the forefront of dealing with these challenges. So they're well positioned relative to other people in the utility industry to deal with these challenges. And so they're going to share more about that soon. And so that is some good news coming up. Affordability, like reliability, is also a challenge. The key concept here is that if you build more generation only for the purpose of meeting mandates, that costs more money. That's the key concept in terms of why I say affordability is a challenge here. And co-ops, of course, first of all, are relatively stable oases in our rates. Xcel and Minnesota Power, two investor-owned utilities, are both in the middle of trying to get something like 20% rate increases right now. The rate stability across the co-ops has been very good compared to other energy industry things in the last few years. The energy as a whole over the last years went up about 30%, not just electricity, energy as a whole. So affordability has been a priority for us. Of course, we live locally. The people that govern Lake Region pay the electric bills for Lake Region, so inherently in our model, affordability is a priority. Supply chain's also an issue right now for affordability. So this is another aspect that we have to pay attention to, and the 2040 bill continues to add some more pressure. Now, Tim mentioned that we were able to get some amendments to this bill. So I'm very pleased that that happened. It was a big step forward in terms of us being able to deal with this new mandate in a way that helps to respect reliability and affordability. The co-ops were the only organization at the legislature that got amendments to the 2040 bill. So I'm pleased about that. I think it was a good achievement. And specifically, I'll talk about those, but a couple, they're related to these renewable energy credits, so I need to tell you what those are in the bill. Renewable energy credits are if you generate wind, but you don't have to prove it was wind or solar, then you can sell a credit, you can sell the attribute that it was wind into a REC market, into a renewable energy credit market. So you don't have to prove to a regulator that it was wind. So you can peel off the fact that it was and sell that into a market. This bill allows you to buy and sell out of that REC market if you're still using gas or coal by 2040. So one of the things that this bill allowed you to do is when I say carbon-free by 2040, if you do still need 5% gas in order to meet your peak loads, you can buy 5% RECs to consider that carbon-free, okay? So that's an important relief valve in the bill because we're going to need gas for the foreseeable future, as I just highlighted MISO saying, for example. So this REC concept allows you to do that in the bill, and the Public Utilities Commission can step in and say reliability and affordability are at risk, so we're going to hit the pause button. We're going to make some adjustments. So that's another relief valve that's in the bill. One of the amendments I mentioned, I'm going to talk next about the amendments we made. One of the amendments we fought for was that really should be our boards for co-ops because we're not regulated by the Public Utilities Commission in most respects, and we shouldn't be. We're regulated by locally elected people that pay our own electricity bills. They should be the one monitoring these relief valves for us. That argument did not prevail. So co-ops, like the rest of the utilities in the state, will be going to the Public Utilities Commission if we feel these standards are threatening reliability and affordability to too great a degree, and we'll be making a case for that to make adjustments in the standards, which is allowed under the bill. So the fact that we are able to work across the aisle as co-ops as effectively as we are is certainly one of the key reasons, as well as our engagement with our communities. The fact that our directors and you all as co-op members engage with our legislators to talk about our concerns, and again, we're able to do that in a bipartisan way. Those were really the key reasons why we were able to achieve some amendments here. And one specific amendment is I had to talk about what renewable energy credits are in order to set the stage for an important amendment we got is by 2030, that's the first timeline. Remember, the bill is 2040 carbon-free, but it sets interim targets. It's by 2030, you actually have to be 80% carbon-free. Except for, under our amendment for co-ops, that number is 60%. That puts us in much better position, not just for GRE, which again has been a leader at getting to these standards already, but even for the other co-ops across the state, puts us in a much better position by 2030 to be able to do that without buying RECs. Because if you couldn't meet the 80%, you had to go to this REC market and purchase wind and solar attributes that other utilities didn't need. And 2030 is tomorrow in the industry. So one of our arguments was, you're not going to change the generation portfolio by 2030 because nobody can build anything that fast. So you're really just telling us we have to go to the REC market. And for co-ops, if we go to the REC market, electricity rates are the direct, we don't have a profit motive. That just means electricity rates are going to go up. So this change for the 2030 standard should be a big help for co-ops for affordability in that it really puts our members in a position of being able to meet that 2030 target, most likely with resources that are going to be available by then. Also, partially clean generation counts. So we have co-ops that are working on carbon capture technology. That means that you have a gas or a coal plant. That's not carbon-free, of course, but if you can put the carbon in the ground, that's one of the innovations being worked on in the industry. If you can put the carbon in the ground, then it becomes carbon-free. That is a pilot kind of effort that's being worked on across the country, including by co-ops. You can't put 100% of the carbon in the ground the way the technology works, but you can put 80, 90% in the ground. And so we were able to get an amendment to say, well, let's allow that plant to continue to operate, and we'll consider it 80 to 90% carbon-free then, because 80 to 90% of the carbon is going in the ground. So that's another important amendment that we were able to achieve to keep the ability to have innovation in that area as an option in the electric market as we go forward. Also made some adjustments to the way RECs are considered in the market. Permitting reform is badly needed to balance reliability and affordability with these new mandates. And it's another huge topic in and of itself, so I won't be able to get into all the details, but it's definitely an area that we're working on at MREA, we're working on at NRECA, we're working on as co-ops, is that the rules were never meant to say you shouldn't build infrastructure, the permitting, NEPA and these kinds of rules. They were meant to say when you build, you should go through a process to do it well. But they've turned into more of a challenge with getting anything built. NIMBY, not in my backyard, has turned into banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere next to anyone. Which is rapidly becoming nope, not on planet Earth. That needs to be reformed, because for any of this to work, we have to be able to build infrastructure and to build it more rapidly than we have in the recent past. The estimates about what does more rapidly mean vary widely. If anybody's looking for definitive answers, I would say as a 30-plus year industry person, we just really don't have them, but we know that there are areas that have to change, and one of those is we actually need more infrastructure, and we need it more rapidly than we've been able to build it in the recent past. And in order to do that, we have to permit stuff. So permitting reform is a huge priority for us at the state and federal level. One of the upsides that Lake Region has been plugged into is making use of some federal grant dollars in order to get more innovative projects built on the transmission and distribution system. Actually today, after about 6 months of work, we're finalizing an application for cooperatives around the state, actually in a few states around here, to make a big application to do a whole bunch of innovative projects on the transmission and distribution system. $500 million worth of projects total, project cost, that would be grant funded by about half of that amount. So $250 million would flow into the co-ops and municipals across Minnesota and again some of the surrounding states. In order to carry out these projects, this gives you a map feel and some bullets on what those projects look like. Lake Region has got some projects under this umbrella. You've probably heard about the hybrid project here if you've come to many of their community meetings. It's a wonderful, innovative project with solar and wind. Included in this bucket, there's about 300 separate projects in this effort. One of those would be here at Lake Region to allow that hybrid project to connect to different distribution systems so that it could be even more effective and provide energy in more circumstances to different circuits. So that's an example of one of the innovative efforts that this effort would help fund through the IIJA project funding coming available, the Infrastructure Act. So this is an area that MREA has been working hard on. Again, today happens to be the day we're actually submitting this application to the Department of Energy, working with the state and a whole bunch of other stakeholders. So it's one of the good news things going on that I just wanted to let you know. And in general, your continued engagement certainly matters. Thank you for being here today. These kinds of activities are great examples of the beating heart of cooperatives. That's engaging with our communities. You know, we don't need more mandates as we make this transition. And if you want to stay engaged, you can look at our website and social media sites. Voices of Cooperative Power in particular is a national, NRECA, we're going to hear from them in a little bit. It's a national channel. It's a national way of plugging into what co-ops are doing all across the country. We actually use this for the first time specifically in Minnesota on the 2040 legislation. Some of you may have helped us engage using Voices of Cooperative Power to send your legislators information when we were working on 2040. If you did, thank you. If you didn't, there's some green postcards that were handed out as you came in. Yep, there's, maybe he can hold that up for, there's a green postcard. Yes, thank you. So that's an easy way to sign up for Voices of Cooperative Power, stay in touch with these issues, and stay engaged. So,
if you have any questions right now, like I said, we have about 5 minutes before we're going to move on to our next presenter. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Here's one right down here in front, Steve.
Test. There we go. So my name's Jason. I'd like to address the rec credits. Because currently, right now, I give all my rec credits for the, at this point, 52 megawatts that I've produced over the last 4 years. And right now, the interconnection agreement requires that I give them to my co-op. So, and I'm assuming everything you guys have for solar installations are producing rec credits also. So why are we not moving forward with a microgrid within our own co-op to where each home or many of the homes have solar producing rec credits that the electric co-op is collecting and then offsetting with purchase of gas as needed and things like that in order to move forward with this a little easier? Because I think instead of doing large installations, that we can facilitate home installations. I mean, I only got 9 kilowatts, and I got 1 electric bill a year now. I went to MREA, which is, for me, Midwest Renewable Energy Association out of Custer, Wisconsin, and Lake Region sends their own guys there for training. I went there for training, and I'm just a DIY guy. And for the numbers, it makes sense for homeowners to do solar, especially if we have local training, we have local facilitation. I mean, I save 30%, and I have about a 7-year payback on my 9 kilowatt. Now, granted, I'm a small business. I operate out of my own residence, so I get a couple additional tax credits. But why can't we move forward? Because how would the rec credits produced by homeowners be able to offset the requirement to buy other energy? I mean, would it be significant?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll make some broad comments in response to that. I think microgrids and more local generation is certainly part of where the industry will continue to head. I think we already are. It's an example of something where we already are going down that road. It sounds like you're an example of that. I think another really impressive example right here at Lake Region is, again, the hybrid project, which is not at a home, but it's kind of the beginning of a microgrid concept where you bring wind and solar together in one site so that when one of them isn't operating, the other can, to try to have local community-based generation. And in the big application I briefly mentioned about some various projects that we're trying to move forward and get some federal funding support to help make them more affordable, doing even more with that project to bring it even closer to what a microgrid might be considered so that it can switch between circuits so that you can use that electricity locally and consume it in your community at even more hours of the day is another advance towards microgrids. Some of the challenges with microgrids I mentioned briefly this concept about the way electricity works is it has to be consumed at the same time that it's generated. So that's one of the things that in order to do that affordably and reliably under all conditions and not stay connected somehow to the bigger grid to help with that balancing, it can be done. It is being done. It's an area where we've done some innovation and we need to do more innovation, but it's pretty early going in making that affordable and reliable. Battery storage, again, which I mentioned in passing, would be a key part of being able to make that more economic, more reliable in a broader set of circumstances that's being worked on. Now, in terms of, you mentioned RECs a couple of times. Of course, the details of managing the RECs is more of a Lake Region question, but I would just say it's another thing that will become more important for co-ops, for the industry in general, is thinking about the way that those RECs are assigned and managed, because generally, the RECs are going to be more valuable in the future than they have been in the past because of these new policies. Look like, do we have time for one more or not?
I think let's hold the question. We're right on time for our next presenter, and I think one of the questions or what this really alludes to is, you know, the transition is happening at all levels, right? Derek mentioned a lot with respect to the generation side of the portfolio. Our next presenter is really going to be speaking to the transmission side of the portfolio. And we recently had some very significant announcements related to, you know, investments that are going to be taking place in the transmission system to connect all of this change and bring them to the market. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Priti Patel, our Chief Transmission Officer for Great River Energy.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Tim and Lake Region Electric Cooperative for inviting me to be a part of the panel today. First, I want to apologize for not being there in person. Unfortunately, an unavoidable commitment occurred for me today in the cities, and I do want to thank both Tim Thompson and Greg Larson for their patience and their accommodation. And I want to also thank the very kind person who is going to advance my slides. So why don't we go to the next slide? So, like Derek said, this is a really important time in our industry to have dialogues like this. This energy forum that Lake Region Electric Cooperative is hosting is just an excellent way to do that. And as you heard from Derek and as you'll hear from other panelists today, there is a lot that's coming our way, and the speed at which policies are changing, the speed at which they need to change. Many of us are putting a great deal of time and energy into understanding what it's going to take to make sure that this fleet transition that is occurring, not just across our state, but our region, that we can continue to deliver reliable and affordable service. And building transmission is a strategic solution to some of the challenges that we face as our generation is transitioning in our region. GRE has always been a long supporter of regional transmission build-out. We believe that it is the link for both reliability and affordability. So today, what I thought I would talk about is the transmission that's being planned for in the upper Midwest and even across the broader Mid-Continent and MISO region. And over the past few years, MISO, along with GRE and many of its other members and stakeholders, has been engaged in a multi-phase, long-range transmission effort. And it's resulted in a multi-phase plan to help deliver regional value over the long term while we continue to meet our near-term system needs. So why don't we go to the next slide? So I always just like to give everybody a quick snapshot of GRE transmission. As you know, GRE is an electric G&T cooperative in the state. We proudly serve 27 members, and they're all located in Minnesota, and the dark blue shading is our member territory. And when you look at the footprint of our 27 member distribution cooperative owners, they collectively serve about 60% of Minnesota geographically and some small parts of Wisconsin as well. So around 1.7 million people, as Jeff said earlier. And over the years, we have built a robust system for both our members as well as the broader MISO region. We've done our share there. And we've got around 5,000 miles of transmission, mostly in Minnesota and some in North Dakota, voltages from 41.6 to 500 kV. And the red lines that you see are GRE transmission. Yellow is some high voltage transmission that we co-own with other utilities. And green is the new regional transmission that we are co-owning and in the process of building. Next, please. And so while we've spent decades building a robust system, we do operate in a state that is a highly interconnected system. And what you see here are the lines of 17 other transmission owners. It just shows how interdependent our system at GRE is to the systems of so many other utilities in Minnesota. So our system, again, here is in red, and the transmission system of others is in green. And blue are our member boundaries. But while our transmission footprint is geographically large, it is incredibly intertwined with systems of others like Xcel Energy, Minnesota Power, Otter Tail Power, SMMPA. A large portion of our member load really does rely on the systems of others from a load serving perspective. An example is Lake Region. The area is highly dependent not only on GRE's system, but also that of Otter Tail Power system. And for that reason, we've established good working relationships with our neighbors so that we can continuously collaborate and plan and solve operational problems together. Next, please. So as we plan our system, it's not going to come as a big surprise to you that these are the principles that guide what we do for our members. The number one most important attribute of electricity is reliability. That is table stakes for us. And as we plan our system, we're guided by what will assist in improving our reliability, affordability, and sustainability. But we know we can't spend money and build a system that is 100% reliable in all scenarios 100% of the time. We know we have to balance reliability against affordability. And we have been hyper-focused on affordability because we have a number of members that serve customers in parts of the states that are the hardest to serve and in some of the poorest communities. And we're particularly focused on that as we're making significant investments to maintain reliability in light of some of the decarbonization goals that you heard about earlier. And of course, all of our decisions are against this backdrop of sustainability. And we don't look at sustainability just from an environmental stewardship perspective, which is important, but we also look at it heavily from a community engagement perspective. So these are foundational to our planning philosophy, which is build, plan, and build the right projects at the right time and at the right cost. And as we're in the middle of a transition, these values are going to become more and more challenging to achieve without the type of thoughtfulness that we all engage in. So next slide, please. So let me just focus a little bit on the load serving aspect of GRE's focus. Like many utilities and cooperatives, we are finding ourselves balancing the needs of our load serving transmission system along with what is needed for us to maintain regional reliability with the generation changes that are occurring. And when I mean load serving, I mean 69 kV and below. And the way we plan our load serving system is really influenced by some of the unique attributes of our system in Minnesota. So like I said, we serve around 2/3 of the state geographically, only about 20% of the electric load. And on average, our members serve 7 customers per line mile. So that does put affordability at the forefront. And our large, low density footprint means some of our members are served by radial lines. So depending on where they are, looping the system can be difficult, it can be cost prohibitive, and that can be a challenge for us. But like I said, we're heavily interconnected with 17 other transmission-owned systems. We know that our members rely on our system, but also that of others. And we also have aging facilities that are requiring some very proactive, intentional annual work. So while regionally, the need drivers for transmission are driven by generation plant retirements, interconnection of new generation, like wind and solar, system stability, more locally, our transmission needs are being driven by spot load growth that we see throughout our service territory. Our load growth is generally flat, but we've got certain places where it's growing or sometimes it decreases, which requires us to respond. It's expanding our lower voltage system because half of our system is, under 100 kV. And we're outgrowing the 69 kV system in our metro area. We're also hoping to upgrade that to higher voltages in certain parts of our footprint as well. And we know that the system has to get upgraded because we see a future where it will get more stressed with distributed generation and electrification in the future. So with regard to age and condition, our system is no different than many others. It was, much of it was built in the 60s and 70s, and we really need to look at upgrading and replacing it in the next 20 years. So this is just a snapshot to show you how we have to balance our spending on our load serving along with some of the regional drivers that we're seeing that are in play. So next, please. So you've likely seen this before, but as we look ahead, utilities and cooperatives like GRE are moving more toward a decarbonized generation fleet, which you've heard Derek talk about, and you'll also hear Zach talk about a little bit later. And it is not changing the fact that the electric grid has been described as the largest and most complicated machine ever built by man. In fact, we expect that the grid will become exponentially larger and even more complicated. Next, please. So as you'll hear Zach Rizicki from Great River Energy talk about this morning after me, our power supply is becoming increasingly renewable. And as you look at GRE's portfolio, just at a high level, and he'll talk much about this a little bit later, in 2021 above, you can see the donut above, versus our projection of what our mix will be below in 2037. You'll see the increase in renewables and the decrease in dependency on more carbon-based resources, right? And this is not just GRE, and Derek alluded to this. This is a trajectory that we're seeing in the entire MISO region-wide footprint, which you can see on the right. So above, you see where the MISO membership and their energy mix is at in 2021. And then you go below and where they're at in 2042. So GRE is a member of MISO, and Derek alluded to MISO, where MISO engages in broad transmission planning, and we are a part of that process. They run the market where we buy and sell our energy, and it's a region that starts from up at Manitoba and all the way down the mid-continent of the US, down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so you see this generation trajectory of MISO over a 20-year period. And again, much of it is going to be replaced with wind and solar. And as this transition is taking place, the primary need driver for transmission isn't just interconnecting this new fleet of generation, it's making sure that we have enough high voltage regional transmission so that our members and their customers can actually get energy from all of the dispersed generation that we will see in the region, that we're getting it when we need it, and it's sufficiently getting to us 24/7 every hour of the year. Next, please. And there have been a number of national, regional, and local studies that have been performed in the last few years, and they all corroborate that a critical component of the energy transition and our end state is both more high voltage transmission and new technology, right? Technology such as long duration storage or other base load dispatchable type of generation resources that are carbon free. And these aren't the only studies that are out there, but these are ones from MIT, EPRI, ESIG, very influential in our industry, but they all have similar takeaways. And the common threads that run through all of these studies is more transmission is needed, and not just any transmission, large scale, regional, interregional transmission. Our grid today has really been optimized for more sub-regional intrastate transfers. Going forward, if we want to take advantage of wind and solar weather diversity, the grid has to regularly move large amounts of power across a number of states and between regions of the country. So the interdependency is growing. And both ESIG and MIT, through their studies, have said that without a large national grid, that is, an interconnecting grid among regions, customers could spend significantly more money trying to integrate renewable resources. So in addition to the transmission, these studies have said we also, if we're going to move toward a decarbonized grid, we really do need new technology that doesn't exist today so that we can make sure that we're filling the gap when there's lack of wind, lack of solar. It's got to have some reliability attributes the new technology does. Next, please. So, while there's been this drumbeat for more transmission, I just want to point out that over the past 10 years, we have been spending money on transmission. There has been growth in the rate base, the transmission rate base across the country. And that's what this graphic is just showing you, is we have spent dollars, but the growth has been flying under the radar, mostly because the investment has been in local reliability transmission projects. For all the reasons I talked about before, it's not been investments in sort of the big stuff like the large multi-state high voltage projects, which is really what's driving the discussion today to support decarbonization and the trajectory toward that. But rather, a lot has been spent across the country on local and reliability projects. For GRE in particular, it's been mainly on our 11569 kV transmission. Transmission owners in MISO over the past 10 years have spent over $25 billion on local reliability, more load serving, age and condition projects. We just haven't spent the kind of money and investment in these larger multi-value projects that go across states and provide regional benefit. But so over the past few years, MISO is has been shifting their planning toward those larger projects, which I'll talk about. Next, please. So given that we've had this resource mix that's changing in MISO and across the country, there is more transmission that's clearly needed, and particularly for us in the Midwest, which you can see on the red bar. So this is a chart from a recent DOE National Transmission Needs Study that shows the increase in transmission that's needed going forward. It's pretty Herculean. Right? It's really to address the changes in generation resources, not just from additions, but from retirements as well. We need more capacity. We need to double the size of our grid. We need big wire, and we need a lot of miles. And what this study shows in the Midwest is we're essentially needing to double the capacity that our existing lines have. We will need to add a number of high voltage transmission facilities in Minnesota and the upper Midwest because we can't do it through just low voltage transmission additions. To just give you an idea, if you have 150 miles of a 765 kV line versus a 345 kV line, you can carry on that 765 almost 6 times the amount of power. And so we are putting a lot of energy at GRE figuring out the voltages that our region can take and working with MISO to see what is the best voltage as we think about some of the high voltage lines that are needed in the upper Midwest to make this transition successful. Next, please. So as we think about what's needed regionally and nationally, this quote is really spot on from Pat Quinlan, that to get where we need to be, we can't do it by building one line at a time. We can't build individual regional transmission lines separately. It's not going to create the super highway that we need to move energy from some of the remote generation locations to load centers. So we really need to make sure that we're planning a robust and optimized plan, and that we're looking at what can provide us with 24/7 energy sufficiency. So a much more comprehensive approach is needed going forward. And that's what GRE has been doing in our region with our regional transmission operator, MISO. Next, please. So MISO and its stakeholders and members have recognized that there's a number of factors in the transition that are creating the need to institute changes to make sure that we can maintain a reliable system. And what you see here is their reliability imperative. So this is the strategic approach that MISO is taking to make sure that they can create all of the market operational transmission solutions to prepare the region. They have recognized the pace of change is increasing. The pace of change is increasing, and they've recognized that there are a number of changes that need to be made in the long-range transmission planning effort, market operations, and other system enhancements. And so what you see on the left are the pie charts, the generation resources that are expected to change. What you see in the middle are the studies that they're undergoing to ensure reliability. And what you see on the right are the different efforts that are underway. And I'm going to talk about this long-range transmission planning effort. Next, please. So here, in that vein, here are just some details I wanted to show you about what's driving the development of regional transmission. MISO uses a scenario-based planning approach, and it's a tool that helps us look at what are the possible future events. So you're answering the question, what if this happens, then what? What do we do? So they develop different futures, and MISO and its stakeholders, including GRE, have created 3 futures. The one on the very left is the least aggressive. And the one on the right, future 3, is the most aggressive. And they all differ in 3 pretty significant ways. So we're looking at what's the degree to which utilities will meet their goals, what is the level of CO2 emission reduction, and what is the level of electrification, right? And depending on the levels, the output of a transmission plan will be different. And essentially what we're trying to do as we study all these futures is we're trying to figure out what is the least regrets transmission plan we can put in place. Because most folks know that regardless of what scenario you look at, chances are you're going to be wrong. So it's best to do a least regrets approach. And you can see that on the right side of this, that clean energy goals aren't just coming from states or utilities, they're coming from both. And that is really making that is really contributing to the fact that this change is occurring now, and we really need to start getting ahead of it. But future 1 is the least aggressive future, and that's the future that was used to develop the first tranche of regional projects, which let's go to the next slide, and I can show you what that future looks like. So this is the least aggressive future that MISO is projecting, that the whole large tranche of 18 projects they approved last year is based on. You have substantial retirements of dispatchable resources, which you can see. You have generation additions that are coming from renewables. On the left, you see what existed in 2020 for capacity, on the very left. And on the right, you see what we're modeling for 2039. What jumps out at you really here is that the retirements over the next 20 years are all coal. Many of the new additions, 56 gigawatts, are solar or wind, and the resulting capacity mix is an even share when it comes to capacity of gas and a combination of wind and solar. So let's go to the next slide, and I can show you how we've been charting our course here with MISO. Is they've got 4 tranches or portfolios of projects that they're going to pursue. And tranche 1 is with that future 1, the least aggressive outlook is tranche 1. Tranches 1 and 2, which you see on the left side, are approximately what the assessment is between $10 and $30 billion, right? Tranche 2 will be approved sometime in 2024. Tranche 1 was approved last year, and Tranche 3 is really going to be projects only in the MISO South region. Right now, the projects of Tranche 1 and 2 are in the upper Midwest and the central parts of MISO. And then Tranche 4 is the connector project. So that will connect the MISO Midwest region to the South region, and it'll help increase the transfer capability between the 2 regions. Right now, there's a limitation of 3,000 megawatts north to south, and then 2,500 south to north. And so we want to focus on how we can expand that corridor. And when it's all said and done, MISO has said this could cost anywhere between $70 to $100 billion. Next, please. So this is the map of the 18 projects that were approved, and it's really considered by MISO as a first step. One of the most complex studies that was done by MISO in its history. It is well ahead of its peers in the country. It does make us proud. The work that we've been able to do is been quite outstanding in the upper Midwest and with MISO. And what you see here are projects in MISO North and Central. And this does allow almost 700 megawatts of capacity import. So Great River Energy is investing and developing and owning 2 of those projects that you saw in the previous maps. I just want to highlight for Tranche 1 that this will enable almost 60 gigawatts of new renewables. And a hallmark of this whole portfolio of Tranche 1 projects, all 18, is that 90% of the projects are using existing right-of-way. And that is a huge strategically important decision that was made, because we want to reduce the impact on local areas. We want to make sure that we can have shorter and quicker implementation timelines and reduce the overall construction cost. And the benefit to cost analysis for all of these projects as a collective was 3.6, which is benefit to cost ratio of 3 to 4 times the benefit to cost, essentially. So this is the ownership that GRE has in 2 of the Tranche 1 projects, the Northland Reliability Project, and I do want to talk about a little bit of the need for both of these projects. That goes from Iron Range to Benton County to Big Oaks, which is right outside of the Monticello substation owned by Xcel to the east. And this is a critical north-south line, and it is planned to support system reliability. So it focuses on northern Minnesota reliability, and it is one of the largest regional projects that MISO has in its portfolio. We recognize the impact to both central and northern Minnesota with the generation shift, as we have more generation that's not only retired, but projected to retire. The surrounding 115 and 230 kV system is becoming weaker as we need to move power from the Twin Cities and southwestern Minnesota up north. So MISO recognized that during the winter, northern Minnesota load can increase pretty significantly, and it really does cause a strain on the broader 115, 230 kV system. So that disparity really spurred this project. The other project, and right now we are in the process of developing and getting our regulatory permitting together for this project. We plan to file with the Public Utilities Commission in a few months. And Alexandria to Big Oaks, which you see on the map, is the other project. And that is part of an existing CapEx 2020 project. And what we are doing with that is adding the second circuit. So they were built for double circuit capability, and we're simply stringing the second circuit on it. So it's a part of a broader project that goes from South Dakota, the Big Stone sub, to Alex, all the way to Big Oaks. But these are both projects that are truly needed for maintaining reliability as generation is also retiring. So all I'll say about this is, Tranche 1 is underway, 18 projects with a $10.3 billion price tag. Tranche 2 planning is underway, and we are heavily involved in this. And this is going to be a pretty complex, this will be a very complex study effort for us. Think of Tranche 1. It was historic, but by itself, it's insufficient to meet our decarbonization goals. It really just laid the baseline. Tranche 2 is what's really going to help us with future scalability and moving this forward. And I think I just spoke to that slide. I think we're on to the next one, please. Thank you. So, like I said, this undertaking for Tranche 2 is going to be a little bit more complicated. This generation mix that the projects will be based on is supposed to supercharge the generation fleet, right? So think of it this way: if Tranche 2 created that base system, then Tranche 2 is adding 2 to 3 times the renewables to the system. So a lot has changed in the past few years with the carbon-free standard, with the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, with renewable goals in the IRPs. So MISO is really now supercharging that second future, creating a future 2A to account for all of the recent changes. And this just goes to the pace of change and how we're on a planning side trying to keep up with it so we can make sure that the right transmission really gets built out. It's just a rapid transition that is happening before our eyes. And so that leads me to my next slide, which is my final summary slide, that, there is a lot happening. The magnitude of the change is transformational, and it's really requiring all of us to work very closely together so that we can make sure that we can maintain reliability and affordability and achieve all of our goals. So with that, I know that was quite a bit and I had to move at a quick speed, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Pretty. Wow, this is huge stuff. Are there any questions? We can probably entertain a couple. I know Pretty's not going to be here for the Q&A, so I think it would be great to perhaps get a couple of questions. I know there's one back there. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Jason. I appreciate the presentation, Pretty. My question is, how does GRE allocate transmission costs to their member cooperatives? When I was looking at the map of Tranche 1, I didn't see a lot of those projects benefiting Lake Region Electric Co-op. And so I'm just wondering, how does our cost allocated from transmission?
Yes. So first off, I would say that, even though a project like the Northline Reliability Project, Jason, doesn't necessarily land inside of the Lake Region area, the one thing that projects like that are really about ensuring voltage stability and other, power system fundamentals. When generation is retired, maintaining stability of the system is so important. And so I would simply say that projects like these, they work collectively. The regional projects, that whole portfolio works collectively to maintain both reliability, but then also appropriate transfer capability. So that's the first thing I would say. The second piece, going to your cost, it's a great question. When projects like this are planned, they are planned knowing that they are providing multiple values. So they're providing values to the whole region. The study and analysis of each of these projects shows that they provide a benefit of reliability, they provide an economic benefit, and they provide potentially a public policy benefit. So you might need a certain project to meet some public policy goals of some states. When they meet those criteria, then the project cost is shared by the entire footprint. So even though GRE and MP are building and investing in that line, we are not the only customers or members paying for that line. That line is getting paid for by all of the MISO Midwest and Central customers on a usage basis. So on an energy usage basis, that is the allocation of cost. So it's a great question, because these are not projects that will be borne solely by GRE. They are borne by an incredibly large footprint of customers.
Great. Thank you, Pretty. And there's one more one question over here.
John is my name. My question in all the transmission issues and the comforts with that and the importance of that, in past reading about the Russian hoax and the electromagnetic impulse destroying or shutting down our entire system, what is being done for our protection in that arena?
Sure. So for EMP you're talking? Yeah, so EMP risks, right? So
yeah, I think that's right, Pretty.
Okay. So just for those who may not know, EMP is usually, well, what it is it's an electromagnetic pulse that is can be caused by a nuclear explosion at a very high level in the air. And what it does is then the blast will propel electromagnetic pulses back to the Earth. And, it can look it can be similar to lightning strikes. They can have pulses, then you can have solar flares, and it essentially displaces the Earth's magnetic field. And so really what is at risk with EMP is it does, there is the potential of damage to really electronic equipment, right? So transmission electronic equipment. So usually controls or communication cables or protective relays. And so I will say that, things like EMP are difficult to protect against. When you think of what it will take to, usually it's in a substation, it's usually substation electronic equipment, you know, to completely cage or protect every single substation becomes, it can be cost prohibitive. So you'd have to really put a cage around it that could take on that EMP impact. You know, some of the research that EPRI has done has shown that this is not necessarily something that could trigger a nationwide grid failure. What they have said is that if we did have an EMP event, it would probably create more of a regional outage issue, so a regional interruption of service. But that damage to large power transformers would be fairly minimal. And so what we're doing is NERC has an effort underway. We are participating in that effort to see what are, you know, cost-effective, but, you know, very good substation protections that can be put into place to mitigate some of these damages. So I appreciate the question. There's always, you know, quite a bit out there when it comes to EMP, but there's not a lot of easy solutions to it because it is so cost prohibitive.
All right, thank you, Pretty. I think in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to keep things going for the next presenters. You know, really appreciate you being able to do this online and virtually. And you talked a lot about the planning that's going on right now on the transmission system. There's planning that's taking place every day. And our next presenter, Zach Ruzicki, is going to talk about our integrated resource planning activities. We essentially are constantly looking at a 15-year outlook. It takes a lot of time to build these assets and make changes to the industry, as Derek alluded to. And so with that, I'm going to bring up Zach Ruzicki, our Director of Resource Planning. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Tim, his staff, all of you for making time this morning to come out here and listen. I'm going to make sure that I leave time for a good amount of Q&A today because I think we have some really interesting things to talk about, the decisions that we make as an organization, why we make those, and where it's led us to this point and why. So like Jeff said, Zach Ruzicki, Director of Resource Planning at GRE. Our group at GRE focuses on long-term planning and strategy. Okay, so we're thinking 10, 15, 20 plus years in the future. All right, and how does that fit with our portfolio of today? And where do we want to be tomorrow? So we've got a great story to tell. Organizationally, GRE, our members and our board have been making forward-looking decisions for quite some time now. Over a decade, we've been planning for the future of where we are today. There's a lot of change in our industry. You've heard Derek talk about it. You've heard Pretty talk about it. I'm going to speak about it a little bit from the power supply side, but we're in an industry that's experiencing technological change, economic change that's impacted by socioeconomic effects, that's impacted by the economy. So there are a lot of different pressures when we think about the power systems and how we plan to serve energy and demand moving forward. Our portfolio is very diverse today. We have a strong capacity position, so the backbone of our portfolio is built with natural gas peaking generators. We have 1,400 megawatts of those on our system today. We also have a firm capacity contract with Rainbow Energy, who purchased Coal Creek Station from GRE in 2020, and I'll talk about that more later. We also have hydro in our portfolio, and our energy that we produce that serves our membership is predominantly produced from wind, and it will be going forward. And there's a difference between energy and capacity. Energy is the energy product to use, so the kilowatt hours that you're using when you flip the light switch in your house. The capacity is the potential resources that can produce energy on the system. So our peaking units, I talked about 1,400 megawatts of those don't produce much energy for us. They only run 2-3% of the time because they're needed when the system needs them the most. Okay, and we're going to get into reliability this morning as well. Our member resources are also an asset to GRE and our membership. We have a renewable member resource option that allows our members to self-supply up to 10% of their energy and demand with renewable resources, and we have a very robust demand-side management portfolio that Jeff and his team run within GRE. That includes energy efficiency, demand response, and a number of other member-sided resources that's going to become a larger part of our portfolio moving forward. We're also members of MISO. MISO is the independent system operator. Imagine just a big pool of energy. It's the energy market in the Midwest. You can see the blue map here. It's a very large footprint. And that is where the independent system operator, MISO, they are the ones who send the price signals to dispatch power plants. They are the regional transmission operator. We have to comply with regulations and rules as a member of MISO and provide a certain amount of capacity every year. So our power supply portfolio, this is a map. The creation of a portfolio, of a power supply portfolio, is kind of an art and a science. And there's a lot of things that go into the decisions that we make. There are economic decisions that go into it. There are policy decisions that go into it. There are risks that you take when you're creating a portfolio. It's just like creating a portfolio in your 401k or in your investment account. Okay, you don't want to be too overexposed to one type of resource. You don't want to have too many things in one sector. Okay, we want to be diverse. And we're diverse by resource, and we're diverse geographically. And those are two very powerful things. You can see the wind that we have, the large green dots out in North Dakota and southern Minnesota. Those are producing a lot of energy for us. Those are great areas of energy production for wind. Our natural gas peaking facilities are in southern Minnesota and in eastern Minnesota. Those are dual fuel capable assets. You can see that the bubble color is purple and blue, which indicates that those units are capable of burning fuel oil as well as natural gas. And that dual fuel capability is extraordinarily important to us during times of reliability need. Okay, if we can't get natural gas, or if natural gas is incredibly expensive, those units can burn fuel oil instead and continue to serve the grid and its reliability needs. That's something that's really important because we've seen that happen in winter reliability events in the past. You know, you hear people talk a lot about California, battery storage, and a lot of things like that. Minnesota is very different. You know, we up here, we know that our reliability events that we're concerned about happen in the winter a lot of the time, right? There are 2-3 days in February where it's negative 30 degrees instead of 3 or 4 hours in LA when it's 105. So we have to think about multi-day reliability events. And the ability for our units to dispatch when they're needed and to run is valuable. We've transitioned away from fossil fuels, from coal, right? And we get a lot of questions as to why that is. And like I said at the beginning of this slide, there are a lot of reasons for the decisions that we make. We've done that primarily for economic reasons. The transition to wind has been one that's driven by the economics of those resources and the cost of the energy production. The pivot away from coal with the sale of Coal Creek Station and the retirement of Stanton Station in 2020 and 17 respectively, those were decisions that were again driven by the economics of those units. They weren't providing value to the membership in the way that they had been for the previous 20 or 30 years, and so we made a decision to move away from those. That decision is one that is, from our rate projections, going to contribute to ongoing rate stability towards the future. We have different types of resources for different needs. I talked about natural gas. You can see here the colored bars represent each season within MISO. And MISO evaluates utilities' ability to meet reliability requirements by season: winter, spring, summer, and fall. And this is new, and I'll talk about this very briefly here coming up. But you can see how the different resources are accredited or given credit for the capacity they provide differently in each season. What you'll notice is that gas is very firm, right? In every season, winter, spring, summer, fall, we can receive a high amount of capacity accreditation. And it doesn't change much. In fact, we get even more capacity from these resources in the winter because these units run more efficiently when the air is cold. The air is more dense, we get better power production out of the units. For wind produces better in the winter. So we get more capacity accreditation from those resources in the winter. Hydro, we have a diversity exchange contract, so it's kind of funny, but we have to send 200 megawatts out in the winter. We get that capacity back in the summer and the fall, so that's a benefit to us on a seasonal basis. That's an exchange contract with Manitoba Hydro. We also have a number of contract purchases that provide firm capacity year-round, as well as our Rainbow contract. The Rainbow contract came about when we sold Coal Creek Station to Rainbow Energy. As part of that agreement, we asked and signed an agreement with Rainbow that we would get capacity and energy off of that unit for a period of 10 years after the sale. And that steps down over time. For the first year, we took basically the full amount of the station in terms of capacity and energy. Then it stepped down to 550 megawatts. Then it's going to step down to 350 megawatts in the next year or two, and that will remain at that level until 2031. That's a great thing for us and for our members because it provides two things. It provides a fixed price energy hedge to the market because we're paying a flat fixed price on that contract, and it provides us with capacity that allows us to transition away from these coal resources, Stanton and Coal Creek Station. While we bring in new resources to our portfolio, we let technology develop that will allow for more cost-effective transition away from those resources. We've put ourselves in a really good position in terms of the transition that we're making, the decisions that GRE has made in the last 5 years associated with our energy transition, the acquisitions of renewable energy, and how we've dealt with our existing fossil fuel technologies. Those decisions that we made, that our board and our membership made in the last 5 years, those are decisions that are currently facing other utilities in the state and the region today, right? And those decisions get harder and harder and harder as time goes on. So the early action that we took are really paying off and benefiting our membership today. Our capacity resources, this is a snapshot of spring, summer, fall, and winter. We plan by planning year. So in MISO tells the utilities that are members of MISO, each year you shall have this much capacity. You need to carry this much capacity, and if you don't, you need to pay to get that capacity from what's called the clearing auction in MISO. So every year, utilities submit all their resources into MISO, and MISO evaluates what types of resources there are, what accreditation they have, and how they contribute to what's called a planning reserve margin, which is the level required to ensure reliable service in MISO. In a timely fashion, MISO just came out with the results from the planning reserve auction for this year this morning and yesterday. And what we see is very different from last year. Last year, you may recall that there was a tight capacity situation that increased the cost of capacity and indicated that there was some shortfall in MISO. This year is very much the opposite of that. In all 4 seasons, MISO sees a surplus of resources, and the capacity prices that we see in this planning year are extraordinarily low compared to where they have been. So that's a good thing, right? That's economics at work. We got a pretty hefty price signal last year, and MISO has responded, and the members of MISO have responded with more resources this year. The seasonal construct, I spoke about that a little bit earlier. This goes to reliability. Right? And we all think about reliability. It's at the top of our mind as a utility. It's at the top of a lot of your minds too as to how do we serve our load and how do we make sure the lights stay on. We're transitioning quickly as an industry from fossil fuels to renewable energy resources. And that transition is one that can't just happen with blindfolds on and assume that the same types of resources that we've had in smaller quantities can increase and serve load the same way that dispatchable resources have in the past. They can't. Today, it would be extremely impractical and economically inefficient to have a 100% renewable energy system. Engineering-wise, it would be very difficult, and from a cost perspective, it would be exponentially more expensive. MISO understands this. We've been working with MISO for several years now on a seasonal construct that will allow for better accreditation of resources. And what this means is that you get different credit for different types of resources. Right? When I talked about gas earlier, if you have a 100-megawatt gas generator, you probably get close to 100 megawatts of credit for having that in MISO. So that's contributing to what we have to provide to MISO. If you have 100 megawatts of wind, under this new construct, we're probably getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% credit for that wind resource. Now, in the wintertime, that changes. You get more accreditation for wind in the winter, so on average across the year, wind is a beneficiary of the seasonal construct. Solar is the opposite. Okay, I think we all understand that previously MISO was evaluating reliability on a summer peak basis. Now we're looking at reliability in every season of the year. Solar was able to provide capacity and service at the time of peak summer needs, so it was accredited at a very high level previously, 75%. Today, in the winter, that has dropped all the way down to perhaps 5 to 10%. And so what that means is that if you're in the business of building resources, if you're looking at what assets do I want to invest in to serve load, solar gives you less bang for your buck now, very much so, than it used to. And that impacts investment decisions, that impacts how we think about planning our system, and it really underscores the value of the existing resources that we have on the system today, our gas assets. Our future energy production, you can see here we have a very large margin of renewable energy providing our energy that we're serving to our membership. We have contracts, and that represents the rainbow contract, and then the blue bar are market purchases. And that's basically if we're providing X amount of energy, but we have a slightly higher amount of energy demand, we can go to the market and purchase that out of MISO. Now, we never purposely plan to be short to MISO. We always provide more resources than we are required to in MISO, but during times of the year where perhaps energy production may dip from renewables, we can go to the market, purchase some energy, and treat the market essentially as a giant battery. And that's one of the benefits of being in an ISO RTO like MISO. Pretty showed a slide similar to this in her last presentation. Our energy transition is very pronounced when you look at this. 57% of our energy came from coal in 2021. By 2027, that same 57% margin will come from wind. The rainbow contract provides 24% of our energy. We have natural gas providing a small amount, as well as our market exposure in hydro resources. This energy transition has been one that's been driven by economics, primarily. Okay, the transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy has been one that has been brought about by the cost declines that we've seen from wind and how that can serve our membership. All of our wind contracts are long-term fixed price contracts, which means that we're paying a flat rate that doesn't increase over time, and that locks in a price that provides us with a hedge to the market. So the way that we think about our portfolio is every resource that we buy, that we build, is simply a hedge to the market. If we need to serve 8 million megawatt hours of energy annually to our membership, and we have resources that can produce 9 million megawatt hours of energy annually, depending on where those resources are located, we are hedging our exposure to the MISO market. So the revenues that we're receiving from our generating assets are offsetting the load costs of purchasing the energy that we need to serve our members out of MISO. Wind is an energy hedge, and it's a huge resource for our portfolio, and you can see from this transition, and I apologize because the numbers are a little bit difficult to read at the top, but in 2005 we had only 144 megawatts of wind. By 2018 that had grown to 650, and by 2025 that's going to be more than 1,800 megawatts. These contracts are very flexible for us. We've been able to negotiate some very creative deals. As part of the Coal Creek Station sale, we negotiated the use of the HVDC line that used to connect Coal Creek Station to the Twin Cities area. It still does, but we're carving out a portion of that to deliver 400 megawatts of wind straight to the Twin Cities area. That does a number of things for us. One, it's knocking out a lot of the geographic differences between price. So if you're building a wind project in North Dakota, say the prices in North Dakota were $15 a megawatt hour below the prices in Minnesota, you were taking a haircut there on what we call congestion, and that spread between prices. So if we were generating 2 million megawatt hours of wind at $15 in North Dakota, but then having to buy 2 million megawatt hours of load in Minnesota at $25, you're losing out there because of that geographic spread in pricing differences. Using the HVDC line allows us to knock that out and deliver wind and get paid basically what we're paying for load. So that's a huge benefit for us as part of the sale. We also are leveraging our existing gas infrastructure to surplus interconnect and basically piggyback off of our gas units interconnections into MISO to deliver our wind energy to help us satisfy our carbon-free standard requirements under new state law. We've heard a little bit about this long-duration storage resource. GRE is working with Form Energy on a long-duration storage asset. This is not a large project, all right? It's not a huge part of our portfolio. It's a pilot project to see how this technology might contribute to our portfolio needs in the future. We know, and I talked about a few minutes ago, we have multi-day reliability events. Okay, so a 4-hour lithium-ion storage resource doesn't do a whole lot of good when we have 72 hours of reliability needs and high prices in the market. Neither does 8 or 12 hours. This resource is a 100-hour asset. It's developed by Form Energy, a company based in Massachusetts, and it's located at our Cambridge peaking station. So what we want to be able to show with this project is that maybe this technology can contribute to a energy landscape in the future that we're moving quickly towards. We've heard from a couple of people today the transition in MISO away from dispatchable resources towards more renewables. We're still going to have a need for dispatchable resources, but as we get more and more renewables on the system, we're going to need more flexibility in how we can serve load when those resources fluctuate. And 100-hour storage is something that can move that energy around at a much more beneficial time scale than a 4, 8, or even 12-hour resource can. I won't spend too much time on this because Derek did a great job summarizing the carbon-free standard, but this is it's not an easy target to meet. But like I talked about at the beginning, GRE and our members have put us on a path to compliance with this years before this policy was even considered at the legislature. We've been planning for a carbon-constrained future as part of our organizational goals since 2010. And we've been taking action since 2010, understanding that in the future we were more likely than not to receive either state or federal policy changes that impacted our ability to continue operating with the portfolio that we had at that time. All right, so those decisions have paid off. We were able to secure wind in the last 5 or 6 years at rates that are less than half of what they are in the market today. If we had waited and been a policy taker instead of a maker of our own destiny, so to say, we would have been in a very different cost perspective today, buying wind at $55 a megawatt hour instead of the contractual purchases that we've made in the last 5 years in the high teens, low 20s, and mid 20s a megawatt hour. You simply can't find wind for the prices that we've locked in today. This goal isn't easy, but it's a policy that we can work with, and it's pragmatic. Derek talked a lot about the RECs, the use of RECs, the ability for us to still use our gas plants, the ability for us to still participate in MISO. These were absolute must-haves for GRE and for co-ops around the state. And to their credit, the legislature did listen to what we had to say. And they allowed us the ability to continue using these critical dispatchable resources for reliability and to continue to access the MISO market, which creates a very strong economic benefit for our membership when we need to. So our move to a renewable heavy portfolio has been driven mostly by cost and by policy risk mitigation. We've increased our renewable member resource options, but we do have a challenging environment for development. And again, this is a benefit of the early action that we've taken, is that the wind that we've contracted for that's already online is not facing some of the permitting and development challenges that some of our later wind is. And we see this happening, and it's a very challenging situation. It's a challenging policy situation from a permitting perspective, being able to permit new wind resources, getting their certificates of need from the Public Utilities Commission, getting the transmission routes that these resources need to deliver energy to the system approved, and then even from a commodities perspective. The cost of building new wind, building new solar, are extraordinarily high today, and those are being driven by supply chain challenges, inflationary pressures. I just mentioned we were seeing wind contracting in the low 20s in 2020-21. We just had some meetings last week with wind developers that are offering wind at $50 a megawatt hour. Right, so we've seen more than double the cost of renewable energy in the last 3 years. And we're now returning to pricing levels that we saw when the original Next Generation Energy Act was passed in Minnesota in 2008. We were contracting wind in the $40, $50 range then. We saw a huge change in the industry to provide lower cost renewables. Now that's completely reversed. And we're seeing wind at $50, solar at $70. Luckily, we don't have to make those investment decisions today because we've already done those things. We just filed an integrated resource plan with the Public Utilities Commission about a month ago that indicates our future path. In a way, having a boring resource plan is a good thing because we don't have anything exciting that we have to do in the next 5 or 10 years because we've already done it. All right, so our next resource that we had coming to the portfolio is a capacity resource. In this case, it was modeled as a storage asset. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to do, but the model that we used represented this capacity need as storage. So that's a 200 megawatt storage or capacity need in 2020. 2031, we have another capacity need represented in this case by solar, and then 2032, some energy that we need. And that energy is predominantly required as that rainbow contract rolls off and as our energy and demand forecasts increase over time. But there's a huge difference, and we hear people talk about the carbon-free standard in Minnesota, and even, as I've said today, we're on a path to compliance today. Our portfolio today should comply with the 2030 and 2035 milestones of the standard as it is today, with no additional action. But there's a difference between planning to comply and actually complying. And those differences are the challenges that we face in bringing these resources to the system. So working with Greater Minnesota, working through challenges in permitting, where we need these resources and when we need them is critical to actually bring them online to comply with the standards that we have to face. We have to have some really tough conversations. We've talked with regulators, we've talked with policymakers, with legislators, with folks in outstate Minnesota, local government officials, as we try and bring these resources on. These partnerships are really important, and Pretty talked about the need for permitting for transmission. We need Greater Minnesota, we need North Dakota, we need South Dakota, we need Iowa to be able to make this work, right? So the conversations that we have need to be productive, and they have been to this point, but there's still work to do. But we feel like we're in a good position. Our portfolio planning has been proactive. It's been driven by economics and reliability, and I'm happy to take any questions now with the time that we have left.
Zach, I think right now we're about halfway through the panel discussions, and we're about 10 minutes behind schedule. And what we're hearing is, we're gradually stepping through kind of a policy perspective, transmission perspective, and ultimately the generation perspective. Tolu Omotoso is going to come up right now and kind of talk about that utility member of the future. And I think this speaks to some of the comments that we heard earlier, like what are the changes that are happening at the demand side, what are the opportunities for members, and I think we want to open up as much time for Q&A after all of the panelists have had, so let's move on and have Tolu come up and provide his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff, Tim, and Greg, for putting all this together, and it's still morning, yes, so good morning, everyone. My name is Tolu Omotosho with NRCA, Director of Energy Solutions. I bring greetings from DC from all my colleagues, so thank you for having me here. I think this is actually my second time in Minnesota in 6 months, so that's a record, I guess. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we've kind of talked about, some of these transmission issues, the policy, and then also integrated resource planning like Zach just talked about. So for me, I'm going to be looking at things from a little bit different perspective, what is actually happening behind the meter. So what are our consumers doing behind the meter, and then how can we still maintain, that relationship engagement like Derek talked about in terms of providing those energy services and needs to them. So I work within the Business and Technology Strategies team at NRCA. So we're a group of engineers and scientists. We just kind of like track technology and then also provide these solutions back to our members. So within my portfolio, I cover distributed energy resources, which is wind, solar, battery storage, and microgrids. So just a little bit of note here. We, like I said, within my department, we have a ton of professionals. So we cover a lot of topics, and we don't try to prescribe solutions to members because, we are a national organization with different member needs across the nation. So whatever I'm presenting today is just some fact in terms of where technology has been and where it's going, as we've seen from our members. So it's not professional advice, and we are not endorsing any particular technology or vendor. So with that out of the way, this is my outline. I'm talking about the membership, how things have kind of changed a little bit behind the meter and where things are going. And then also overall industry trends, challenges and opportunities. And then we'll also talk about a little bit about NRCA's position on all of these things. And then I'm going to touch on virtual power plants, which is kind of like one of the questions you asked earlier today, kind of leaning towards that side in terms of how do you leverage all this asset behind the meter from your solar array to maybe microgrids, and then also bringing value to the membership and then also to the utility. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the consortium approach to the BIL. I think Derek also mentioned they're working on this big grant here in Minnesota. That's really good. So I will talk about what we are doing at the national level on behalf of all the co-ops. So first, utility members of the future. So what we are seeing, actually, things have changed from 1939, 36, when electric cooperatives started serving membership. We're seeing members now wanting to be more engaged with their utility, right? So how many people have a smartphone here? Everybody, yeah. So there's really no rotary phone anymore anywhere. Some people still have it, but and then also the way we consume things has kind of changed, right? I think there's only one Blockbuster store in the US right now, somewhere in Oregon. I wonder why it's still there. Everybody watches Netflix now. So the same thing is happening, right, with the electric grid. Things have changed, regardless of what is happening in front of the meter, also at the very high level, policy level, with generation, transmission, and everything like that. The way members consume and interact with the grid has changed, right? So in addition to having smartphones, we have all the smart apps, right, where you can use to track your energy use. You have your solar, you have your battery storage. So people have moved, right, from being just a transactional rate payer, which was the case before, to now the point where you're a prosumer, with all of the assets you have behind the meter. And then we're seeing that this transition is moving, right, to where you would want this transumer kind of people on the grid where they're pretty much smart. So you are generating and consuming electricity at the same time. And this is where we see that the industry is actually going. So, and this is being driven by a lot of the things that we've spoken about today, from decarbonization and then also decentralization and digitalization of the grid. So the way we would interact and solve member problems in the future also has to evolve with these things that we are seeing change behind the meter. Then, in terms of the trends, Zach mentioned this a little bit now in terms of the cost. We've seen a decrease in cost over the past 10 years, drastic decrease in the cost of solar and also battery storage. There's been a little bit of uptick in the last maybe 1 or 2 years due to, supply chain issues. I think COVID pretty much threw everybody for a loop, right? So for the past 2 or 3 years, we've been trying to figure out how to get back to our normal lives before COVID. So there's been a little bit of uptick in the price of these renewables, but in the long term, what we're expecting is these prices to continue to drop. And as they drop, you see there will be more people kind of installing assets, both behind the meter and also in front of the meter. And then when you see all of these new renewables come on, both large scale and small scale, what is happening is that there's a lot of queue, on the transmission level to interconnect these large scale renewables on the grid. So currently, I think this might be a little bit old, but currently we have about 930 gigawatts of solar just waiting to be interconnected. And I think Derek also mentioned this as part of the things that need to be improved to make sure that we can actually get some of these mandates in place. Because if you have all of these mandates and whatever, and there is really no improvement in these permissions to interconnect, then it really makes no sense. Then the other thing that we have been looking at is extreme weather, right? So over the past 5 years or so, we've had a lot more of these extreme weather events occur than the last probably 15, 20 years combined, right? So almost every year now, there's going to be a reasonable expectation of some hurricane or whatever, which damages more than $1 billion each in areas like Florida and then also other areas on the coast. So these extreme weather events keep occurring more and more every year. So we have to do stuff to make sure that we can still provide power reliably to all our members behind the meter. Then, okay, we've already talked about this, so I'm just going to skip this one. MISO came up with an updated number yesterday, so this slide is very old right now. The other thing looking at is the levelized cost of energy. So by the time you look at everything all together, and Zach also mentioned this, you want a balanced portfolio, so you just invest in maybe Bitcoin, and then all of a sudden, your money just goes away, right? So you want a balanced portfolio also for the electric grid. And then part of what we are seeing is the levelized cost of energy and comparing, all these various sources of energy, because that's the only way you can make sure that you are making the best financial decisions for your members. Overall, renewables are still providing very good value for money, and I think it's going to be improving as we move down the line. Then, where NRACA stands on this, and that's where I started with my little bit of disclaimer, because NRACA represents the interest of almost 900 electric cooperatives in Washington, D.C. So part of NRACA's job is advocating on behalf of all these co-ops. And we want to do that in such a way that everybody is kind of satisfied. And you can imagine how difficult that is going to be. So what we are trying to say here is that we are focusing on providing reliable, affordable power to our members, regardless of the sources where these energies are coming from. We are, committed to the energy transition, but we want to do that in a very, very safe way to make sure that, the whole goal of having electric cooperatives in terms of providing power to rural and remote areas is not kind of jeopardized with, some of this very aggressive transition. Then now kind of trying to bring all of this together, from some of the congestion we have in front of the meter and to the members already installing all of these assets behind the meter. How do we leverage these new resources, right, and put it into this basket that Zach was talking about, right, to provide safe, reliable power to the membership? So then there's this concept of virtual power plants that I'm going to be going through. And before I go there, just looking at the grid itself as a whole, so Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, they provide this graphic every now and then. And looking at the entire grid, when you generate, transmit, and distribute power to the end use, about 60% of that energy is actually lost. So from the generation to transmitting to distributing. So in a way, the grid itself is very inefficient, in quotes. So the more that you can generate these energy sources very close to where they are consumed, right, the better it is for everybody. So if we have renewables that are closer to where they are being used, it means everybody wins, right? So sometimes it might not match one for one, right? If you have like a solar or battery storage in terms of your generating source, it might be a little bit more expensive than having your coal plant somewhere. But by the time you look at it as a whole, in terms of the entire grid and then some of the losses that you would encounter, some of these generation that are closer to the source are better for you in terms of the overall cost. So then now down to virtual power plants. So, what is a virtual power plant? Virtual means it's kind of like there, but not there, right? So it's there when you need it, right? And then it just goes away when you don't. So being able to aggregate, assets behind the meter, solar, battery storage, smart thermostat, smart water heaters, things that you can actually use to regulate supply and demand on the grid. Aggregating all of this together, providing capacity on the grid is essentially what a virtual power plant is. And this is a quote from Jigar Shah, who is the director of the Loan Programs Office. So the U.S. spends about $10 billion every year balancing the grid, right? So when you have all these projections from ISO, we're going to have maybe high temperatures in the summer or whatever like that. So during those periods of elevated demand on the grid, you have to fire up maybe peaker plants or some coal plant that wasn't supposed to be running before. So balancing all of that costs about $10 billion a year. So what if we can, divert some of those things behind the meter, where you have your members that have actually installed some of these assets and are just sitting there, right? If we can leverage those assets and then also provide some benefits to the members for being able to use their devices behind the meter. So both residential and then also commercial and industrial members. And there was a pilot kind of that was carried out, in the CAISO territory, I think, last year with Tesla. So I think about 2,500 homes were able to participate in that. They got about $2 per kW compensation and supplied 18 megawatts to the grid during that period, that pilot period. And, people actually made money from that. So there's this guy that I just captured this from the internet where Tesla sent him his check. So for allowing his utility to use his battery behind the meter during the period of grid congestion, he made about $600, right? So as we go on and there's more opportunities to leverage all of these assets, we can actually save a lot of money from building bigger transmission, building bigger plants, and also helping members behind the meter. Because now, if you have assets that you can actually make money off of, I don't think this guy was expecting to make $600 a year on his Tesla Powerwall, but now that is an opportunity. And I will show another slide as we move forward. There are tons of these assets just sitting there behind the meter. So being able to leverage that is going to save the utility a lot of money. It's going to save the GNT a lot of money. And it's going to make a lot of money for the members behind the meter, which is a win-win-win scenario for everybody involved. So I have some friends at Generac, and usually when I do these talks, I just tell them, hey, can you just give me a snapshot of what is behind the meter at this location? So this is just Generac alone. So Generac has about 80% market share in the generator area, and I know you guys also have a generator program, which is good. So overall, across the nation, there is about $2 million home standby generating sets right there. And some of those are ready to be kind of like leveraged, and some of them are not. But this is just the scale of what is there. About 30,000 batteries from Generac alone. There are other manufacturers, and about 4 million thermostats. So if we start looking at all of these, then you see that there is actually this huge opportunity, right, to leverage these assets and make money for everybody that is involved in it, and then also save a lot of money for the utility. So, and the other thing driving some of these installs, like I showed earlier with extreme weather events that keep, rearing its head almost every year, they've seen a huge uptake in Florida just because of the continuous hurricane, every other year, every year. So they've peaked at, I think, about 200 installs per week since January 29. And you can see there are some spikes right there. When you see like a really, really big spike that here and here, it's always after there is an hurricane event. Because all of a sudden you have this hurricane, people lose power for a few days, and you'll be like, okay, you know what? I can't do this anymore, right? So I need to get something to carry me through whenever this happens. And this is the opportunity for virtual power plants in Minnesota. So they sent me this screen grab for all of the co-ops, I think, in Minnesota. So, like I said, again, this is just Generac because there are other manufacturers and then also other thermostat providers. But for now, I think they have about 6,000 home standby generators that could actually be leveraged into all these virtual power plants. And since you guys already have a generator kind of program, I think this is another area that can be, beneficial if you have not already started doing that. Then, now the question is, how do we actually roll out all these programs, or how do we fund them? Well, the good news is we have a lot of money from this bipartisan infrastructure law. Yeah. So this is the biggest, as I've heard, investment in the grid ever, right, since inception. I mean, I wasn't here when the grid was built, so I wouldn't know, but what people are saying is this is the biggest investment in the grid. It's, I think about $1 trillion in this bipartisan infrastructure law. And several departments have several billions of dollars to spend. So there's the GRIP funding, which I think you guys are also part of, about $10 billion. There is the OECD ERA funding, which is another $10 billion. USDA just released their own guidance 2 days ago, which our leaders at NRCA worked closely, with the government to make sure that this money actually benefits co-ops. So what we have done at NRACA is to group this funding opportunity in 5 different topic areas. So we're looking at cybersecurity, we're looking at electric vehicles, we're looking at microgrids, natural hazards, and then also smart grids and data. So I lead the microgrid consortium for NRACA, and then it's also a clean energy consortium. So what we're trying to do is to look at opportunities to help electric cooperatives actually apply for this funding, because sometimes, especially these smaller co-ops, right, there are some maybe challenges in terms of going after this funding, from grant writing to the grant implementation and everything like that. So we are providing that service to the membership, right, at the national level. So anyone that is interested in joining the NRACA effort, you can pretty much join any of these consortia online. So currently we have, about 250 co-ops that are part of this, 400 member staff, 33 GNT. We also have assured members that are part of this, and that is the geographic spread of our consortium as a whole. Like I said, it's money for everyone, right? So I got this somewhere. I think this was when Oprah was giving everybody cars, So there's a ton of money. And the old, kind of like backstory, or the point here is we need to capture as much money as possible for the cooperative and then also for the members that we serve. So for our GRIP funding, which was submitted, I think, a few days or weeks ago, we have 39 cooperatives with wildfire mitigation, about $100 million. Storm hardening, about 14 cooperatives with that, $60 million. And then we also have DERMS, drones, SCADA, whatever, $200 million for that, for about 70 cooperatives. And also, when I was preparing for this talk, Tim told me Lake Region also submitted for GRIP, for substation projects, utility battery scale, and then also residential battery projects. The other thing, aside from the GRIP, we're also working on the OCED era concept papers. So we've turned in the concept paper. We're waiting for the DOE to give us a go-ahead to submit full applications. So across all of that also, it's about, I think, close to $200 million of projects that we've submitted on behalf of co-ops, about maybe 79, 80 different co-ops. Some of them are getting to different projects across these topic areas that you can see right here. Then, in addition to that, aside from what the utility can benefit from, there are also direct benefits to consumer members, from this IRA, and then some of them, there are rebate programs that you can use to pretty much make your house more energy efficient. Some of them you can buy heat pump, water heaters, heat pump, HVAC systems, which come at a very, very significant discount. And I think the way they are trying to do these rebates for now is to make it at a point of sale. So you don't have to send in any forms, whatever like that. You just go, whatever you buy to get your discounts at a point of sale, and then it's done. So they are still trying to come up with ways to actually roll out this program. It's already at the state level, so we will be tracking these as things come out. So also, there's also grants for the manufacturers to make stuff, in the U.S. Part of what we are talking about is supply chain, because some of these things you have to source them, maybe from, nations that are not so friendly to the U.S. So there is a lot of money in here for manufacturers to actually make this, clean energy projects in the U.S. Then there's also stuff for contractors. So in addition to the consumers, the manufacturers, the contractors that are installing, these devices or this, equipment in our members' homes also have, some form of money to spend, right? So there is contractor rebates for qualifying era projects, and then also they have some money for training and also workforce development in their territories. So I think that's the end of my slide. I don't know if I still have some time to take some questions.
I think we're maybe we can take one question. There's one question back here before we bring up Julie Lucas from Mining Minnesota.
Hello, my name is Brian.
Hey, Ryan.
And this is piggybacking off of the first question regarding, microgrids and generation and the collaboration with our co-ops. I believe that RECs are uniquely positioned to leverage its member investments in generation and storage in a virtual way to accelerate the transition in a capital efficient way. I think your presentation directly hit on that area. So my question is threefold. How can RECs accelerate standards, pilots, rate innovations, and shared investment incentives? You highlighted some federal opportunities, but how can we actually get it done at the local level? Again, this is why I believe co-ops are uniquely positioned to lead the country in this manner. What are the current roadblocks from a permitting hardware and or software to VPP? And lastly, again, how to get it done. How can we educate members of the opportunity to participate in this collaboration and help with design and planning if individual members or small businesses are looking to make these investments?
Very good question, Ryan. I always love getting questions in areas where I'm working, so I don't have to really think about an answer because I already know. So thanks, Ryan. One of the things you mentioned is in terms of how we can educate members, on all these things, and then also roadblocks for virtual power plants. So I'm going to start from the beginning in terms of how we actually do this. So we have a pilot right now running at the NRCA level, and we are focusing on large multi-site energy users, CNI accounts, right? So they have all of these goals behind the meter, right? All these ESG goals they need to meet and everything like that. And our pitch to them is, hey, we can all work together to come with a win-win-win scenario in all of these cases. So for example, the project I'm actually working on, I'm going to try not to name names, but we have a large retailer that we're working with right now, and they are looking to install a renewable energy and microgrids behind their meter. So we have about 3 cooperatives that are in this pilot, and we are looking at developing joint projects with them such that we can fund those projects through the electric cooperatives by leveraging, all of this federal funding, and these private companies can also come in with maybe some of the cost share, right? And there are different value stacks for them. So for the cooperatives, their main goal here is to maybe save some money, either through peak shaving or peak shifting. So we use the microgrids for that. For the retail, giants or whatever, multi-site energy users, one of their major things is resilience. So in those areas like in Florida where you have multiple hurricanes and then you have to go off maybe generating sets for a couple of days or weeks, that is expensive. And then also in addition to that, you lose a lot of money from having to dispose, perishable goods, that are in the freezer. So for that, they will be using the systems for resilience purposes. And that way, value stacking those joint projects makes it a lot more financially viable for everybody involved. Because by the time you calculate how much it will cost you, right, to throw away all of those goods and then also run on gen sets for maybe a couple of weeks, it's cheaper to develop those renewable energy projects as a microgrid behind the meter with your utility where they can also benefit. So, and then with that, once we are done with this pilot, it should maybe end by the end of the year. We would have a kind of like a business plan, business model using that pilot, and then we can share that through our business and technology strategy reports that we give out maybe occasionally through the co-ops. Then I think lastly, you talked about roadblocks for virtual power plants. We are still trying to kind of like figure out that. Right now, there are a lot of roadblocks in terms of standardization, right? Maybe connecting to all of these utility AMI systems, and then also making sure that you can select one provider and be able to connect to multiple devices. So we don't know what that is going to look like yet. We're actually running a survey right now to capture some of these concerns from co-ops and then also from vendors. And once we are done with that, we will also release a report to share with everybody.
All right. Thank you, Tolu. Yeah, it's getting increasingly complicated, and there's a lot of new things that are coming onto the system. And one of the key questions is, how do we create the jobs and identify where to extract the materials to actually construct and make those new things? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Lucas. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me here. This is out of my comfort zone. There's some trees here, but compared to the trees and lakes I'm used to in northeastern Minnesota, it's a little different. I want to talk about privilege, and that's probably sounds strange. This has been really great for me to listen to today. So I'm Lake Country Power, and in the 15 years that I've lived where I've lived, there's been one period of time where I haven't had power for 36 hours. That's the longest I haven't had power. And it was the big thunderstorms we had roll through northeastern Minnesota last year. And it took out a huge swath. And when the power did come back on, I had to go around my house shutting off all the things that I had tried to turn on. Because I've spent a lifetime just assuming I will have power when I turn on a switch, assuming I will have heat when the temperatures inevitably drop to 40 below. That's a life of privilege. And I don't think we should ever lose sight as Minnesotans and as Americans on what that means for us. And so today I'm going to talk about why we have that privilege. It's metals. It's mining. We've spent a lifetime as Americans relying on coal or gas to keep us warm, to keep our TVs on, to keep our vehicles going where they go, and that's privilege. And it's not going to change as we go forward here. Mining, natural resource extraction is still going to be what we rely on. And the problem with that is that we're having really terrible conversations about mining because we're not really having conversations. I think it was Derek's slide that had nope. Was it yours or was somebody else? Nope. And sometimes I'll talk to folks. Sometimes folks won't even talk to me when they find out what I do for a living. For years, I've used a trick where if I have to fly somewhere and someone sits down next to me and they're chatty, I'm an introvert, so I'm always like, oh. But they'll say, oh, so what do you do for a living? And for years I've said, oh, I do environmental work. Because I did. I was an environmental manager at an iron ore operation for over 10 years, and they're like, oh, the environment's just so important to protect, isn't it? And I'm like, yes, it is. And they say, where do you work specifically? And Hibbing Taconite Company. What's that? Iron ore. It's a mine. It's 8 miles long. There's a slight environmental impact. But it's too late. By then, they like me. So we need to be talking about it. We need to be honest. When our industry saw this mandate come through, what we saw was a mandate for more mining. When I hear folks talk about the length of power lines, and I realize copper, beautiful, beautiful copper, is what is needed, I wonder why we're not talking about that. This legislative session is wrapping up, and we've been told nobody wants to talk about mining. Don't bring up mining, Lucas, whatever you do. How are we not? Honestly, this is embarrassing that we can't talk honestly about where our privilege comes from. It's okay. Mining isn't good or bad. Mining is. How we do it is good or bad, but mining in and of itself, it just is. And we've relied on it so long that we don't even think about it. It was really good for me to make this drive over here because I don't get to this area of the state very often. And it was good for me to see all the farms. We don't have farms. We think we do. We don't. We're like, oh, that's cute, 40 acres. But you don't see what we see. On my drive south, I drove past several mines. Big mines. The iron ore mines are big. And that's just my background. I'm just used to it. I don't even notice anymore. People will stop on the side of the highway to take pictures of it. I'm like, it's just a mine. But I just take it for granted. And the electric transition is metal hungry. It's very metal hungry. We're going to go from fossil fuel dependence to mineral dependence. And I know, well, actually, that probably shows up pretty well. An electric car, metal, so much metal. Wind, solar, metal. And that's okay. It's okay. But let's not talk about it. What's crazy about Minnesota and why it blows my mind to see that we're one of the most aggressive states for going to this transition is that we have the metals to support it. Not 100%. Because I'll hear folks say, yeah, we have copper, nickel, but it's not 100% of our needs. Our iron ore industry is not 100% of our country's steel needs either, but it's still something. If I walk out in that parking lot right now, I can almost guarantee you all the steel that's in that parking lot started its life in northeastern Minnesota or Michigan. Vast majority. I can't imagine it's not actually all of it. And we're not just iron. We have all of these other metals. The universe, it's crazy. Are there any actual closet geologists in this room? I would probably know because geologists are, you can sense a geologist a mile away. They're just really happy people. And what's crazy about Minnesota that most folks not in our region, you don't know this because why would you know this? This would be a weird thing to just know casually. We've always had, everybody knows about our massive iron ore resources. I shouldn't say everyone. I actually just met someone from the state of Minnesota who said, oh, the historical mining. And I'm like, historical? We have 6 operations. We produce 48 million long tons of iron a year. That's not historical. That's today. But those resources started 2 billion years ago. So the Mesabi Range, the Cuyuna Range, the Vermilion Range, that's a 2 billion year old formation. The Earth got enough oxygen, the iron oxidized, dropped out, voila. But then 1 billion years later, we got this cool thing called the Duluth Complex and the Tamarack Intrusion. Because 1 billion years ago, our Earth thought, North America is just a little too compact. How about we just split it in half? And so it tried to split itself apart, the mid-continent rift. You guys keep talking about mid-continent energy. I'm like, no, it's a mid-continent rift, where the Earth tried to split itself apart. And when it did that, all these volcanoes underground, all the magma, the mantle melted, and it blurped up into our world. And it blurped up into the crust. And when it did that, it brought with it copper, nickel, platinum, palladium, gold. And that's why we have that Duluth complex that you see on the map. And it's why down in Tamarack, Minnesota, Aiken County, we also have the Tamarack Intrusion, which is talon metal. So Tamarack, the intrusion just means the Earth intruded up into itself. So these are our projects. These are where the resources are. And they're not insignificant resources. These are world-class, some of the largest untapped metal resources that we have. We need copper. As you talked about building transmission lines, copper is a beautiful thing. Electrons just keep hopping along copper. We're going to need to mine it. We know we're going to need to mine it. Are we talking about where we're going to do that, though, and what that looks like? And some people don't want to. They do not want to talk. Minnesota is off limits. It's wet. We have the best watersheds in the world. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what mining means. Because our watersheds are really important to us, and they should be. But there's watersheds everywhere, and they're really important to whoever lives there. Folks like to think we can recycle our way out of this. We can just recycle. What are you recycling? I live close to Xcel Energy's massive, the big power lines that come down from Canada. And when those were being built, there was a gentleman who thought it'd be a good idea to steal metals from that power line, and he died. And he thought it'd be a good idea to steal from that site because metals are worth a lot to recycle. We are recycling. Anyone who's a contractor knows if you have copper wire on your site, you better make sure it's under lock and key because people will recycle it. We do recycle. But what we are asking for this world to produce is on a scale that we just have not got to. 70% of all the copper that's ever been mined is still in circulation. We know how to recycle it. We are recycling it, but there's just not enough in circulation to support it. And I put EVs up here, but it's just because I want us to walk through some math. Right now, 2.6 million light fleet vehicles in Minnesota, just Minnesota, not the nation, not the world, just Minnesota, and only 1% of those are EVs. If each one of those has 6 times as much metal as a non-EV car, and if by 2035, Minnesota's all new cars have to be electric or hydrogen powered, where are those metals coming from? Those batteries, I mean, it's not like cars just keep trading in. Ideally, those cars are going to run to 10 to 15 years on those batteries. So what are we recycling? We need to recycle, though. I'll talk about that here in a second. I see you getting twitchy over there at the time. It's fair enough. How are we powering these cars? I drove up. I had to go down to the Twin Cities yesterday. Then I came up on 94 yesterday. And as I was driving my little Camry, I thought, what would I have to do if I had to charge this? Where are all those charging stations? How is energy getting to those charging stations? How is that energy being captured in the first place? We have to have those talks. And recycling is a huge part of that. But the International Energy Association estimates by 2040, recycling is only going to provide 12% of all the metals and minerals. It's not enough. And like I said, the US, Minnesota, we can't provide all the metals. But if we're not going to ask ourselves what we can provide, that's embarrassing. It's unethical. It's selfish. We are asking other countries to please provide for our privilege. We're better than that. That wasn't supposed to end with a question mark, but I live close to Canada, so I talk like Canadians. Please don't let there be any Canadians in the room who yell at me. We are better than that. These metals can be continued to be reused and recycled. Minnesota metals could power a big portion of Minnesota indefinitely. Metals are beautiful. They recycle well. And I'm not going to ask you to remember all this, but I do want people thinking about this. We don't mine willy-nilly. I started my career at a mine site that did start before all these regulations, and there's a gentleman in the room who spent his summers there, and I'm going to hope it wasn't his fault that I had so much work to do to clean up the place. We need these regulations. I've seen what happens without these regulations. We need the agencies that oversee us. It's important that we empower these agencies to oversee us. And it's important that we have watchdog organizations that oversee the folks that are supposed to be overseeing us. But it's important that we talk about that and we be open and honest with ourselves in our consumption. This is a book that came out not that long ago. And some folks say, we don't need to talk about cobalt because lithium iron phosphate battery, we're just not going to use cobalt. Okay, let's talk about all the other metals then and where they're coming from. I'm really proud of American steel. When I see something has been made with American steel, I know the iron ore mines that it came from. I know how stressed out the environmental managers are there. But I also am married to a steel worker, and I know what our health insurance is like. I know what his wages are like. Sometimes he doesn't even know what his wages are like, because I just take care of that. But I know what his safety programs are like and what our safety managers do. And that's part of that too. We need better conversations. We cannot be talking about this transition without asking ourselves how we are constructing it. Whoop, look, I even set myself a timer to yell at me. So that's all we're asking for. We're not asking for people to be pro-mining. We're asking people to be just pro having a true conversation about it. So thank you for inviting me, and we'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Julie, and let's give a hand to all of the panelists today. This was great. And now we've reached that time, and Julie, I want to thank you for accelerating your talk, and it was great, but you've gotten us back on time. And that I very much appreciate. And so now we've entered into that phase of Q&A. We didn't have a chance to necessarily have questions after every one of the panelists, but now we've got all of the panelists ready to answer the questions that you have. And so with that, we do have the floating mic. Steve's back here, and we can start taking some of the Q&A. We've got one right up here to start with, right here. Sorry. Phil's going to be, or Phil. Steve's going to be the Phil Donahue of the afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for all the good information. Charlie Gurnwell, retired transmission planning engineer. And one thing I was curious on, I've been following the macro grid cross-country concept, leveraging wind and solar diversity across the country. And a couple of key people in Minnesota are part of that. It promises to have a 2.5 to 1 benefit the cost ratio, and as a Lake Region customer, I'm thinking about reducing the curtailment costs that are increasing exponentially, and also the reserve requirements. So I'm just wondering what the GRE perspective is on the macrogrid. Is this something we're behind? And granted, it's going to be a challenge to right away and all that kind of stuff, but it seems to hold a common denominator to almost every topic that's been discussed today.
That's right. Zach, do you want to take that one?
I don't know if I'm on.
Not yet.
Not yet. Good for everybody. Good news.
There you go.
Okay. So, I think I interpreted your question as to the larger transmission development nationwide, and especially with respect to helping to bring renewables where they're needed. You're right. We do have a lot of bottlenecks, and we do have a problem with what's called curtailment. You mentioned curtailment. Curtailment happens when you have too much energy and nowhere to go. Right. So what happens? MISO will send a price signal. The wind generator will cut. You'll lose generation amount. That generation amount, usually in contracts, has to be paid for anyway. So you're paying for energy that's not being produced. That energy is being curtailed. It's not being produced for the system. It is a problem. Curtailment and transmission congestion. There are a number of things that are being done at MISO and at utilities to help to address this. Obviously, Bree talked about the long-range transmission plan, tranches 1 and 2. There's even a 3. We have a lot of smaller scale local transmission projects also that are designed to help to eliminate or minimize congestion. The one downside is you never really get rid of congestion, you just move it somewhere else. Right, so you take the problem, you take it from here, you move it over here, you move it up here. There's always going to be congestion on the system. We see the MISO queue is the list of resources trying to get on the grid. That is enormous. Right? I mean, I think we have 100 gigawatts of renewable energy trying to interconnect into MISO today, which is a lot. There needs to be transmission build. When I talk to our transmission planners, they say we can't build transmission without the generation. And we can't really build the generation without the transmission. So it's a chicken and the egg concept that we go back and forth with on the transmission planning side, and it's an ongoing issue. It's something we're trying to address, and we're working with MISO closely on it to help to build that transmission to move the energy where it needs to go.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I'll just affirm the importance of that concept, transmission in general. I think you've heard that theme in general this morning, and I'll just say again, I think it's clear from anybody that's really looked at trying to solve these challenges in a serious way that we need a lot more transmission capacity in order to make these things come together and work effectively. You're asking, Charlie, specifically about the macro grid, which again is, instead of building a lot more relatively small lines, let's try to focus on building some big lines that provide additional capacity. And the benefit there, just in general, and Pretty spoke to this specifically, she used an example of as if you double the size of the line, double the voltage, you can get about 6 times the amount of transfer over that by doubling it. So instead of building 6 different lines, let's build one that's bigger, and that's kind of the concept of this macro grid concept. So I think that is something that makes sense to be trying to look at, and that there is a fair amount of energy, and it's different than the way we grew up in the electric utility industry, where generally utilities in a local area, not just co-ops but all electric utilities, have built transmission lines to get from their generators to their loads. And so this concept of let's interconnect broadly across the country, it's not like that's a brand new concept, but it is kind of a different way of thinking about building electric lines than we have historically. And I think it's an important concept to be working on. And then I would just emphasize again, all of that, whatever that looks like exactly, again, the studies range about how much more transmission, doubling it in the next couple of decades is kind of a rough average. Some studies say more, some say maybe not quite that much. So it took us 100 years to get here. We need to double that in about 20 years. But permitting is moving in the opposite direction right now. And so it's really important that in order to enable that, we get some reforms so that we can build things in a reasonable amount of time, any lines in a reasonable amount of time. And macro, doing bigger ones would mean you'd have to build fewer of them because they're each bigger. But regardless of size, being able to build a transmission line right now it takes 10 years at least to get a transmission line built, but the building it piece is easy. That's a couple of years. It's well known how to do that. The permitting is at least an 8-year horizon, and then the answer may be no, and there may be more lawsuits. And so doing something to return some balance to that, no matter what size those lines are, is really an important piece of where we need to go.
We have a question right down here.
Check. All right. Thank you. My name is Nathan. I've got a question, I think, for Derek and Zach, both. It sounds to me a little bit like Minnesota especially is heading rapidly towards what feels like a cliff on some of this stuff, and without thinking about the mining portion, which you brought up, and that if we're going to ram right to electric vehicles and all these other things, and I just listened this morning on news about the average cost of the American vehicle right now, starting, they're as high as they've ever been, is $50,000. Electrical vehicles are $66,000. But with that, you've got all these pressures, these external pressures, which feel like a lot of it's legislative. And you mentioned, Derek, you mentioned the need to build more rapidly and more than ever. And to me, it seems like that's going to be in direct opposition of private property rights. And when we've got different legislative bills that are trying to be passed, and certain ones this last session there's eminent domain that's being added to DNR things and such stuff like that. Can you talk about how the land rights issue, we got a lot of farmers out here, you mentioned that, but there's a lot of farmers out here. You're going to start CO2 sequestering and all that stuff to get it out to North Dakota that's going to run right in direct defiance of private property issues. So that one for you. And then Zach, I had one for you about the wind and solar. You said the cost is $50 to $70 a megawatt hour. Was that to build and operate new if you're bidding them today? Because when I worked at the Elk River Station, we were told if you can get your cost per megawatt hour down to the $45 to $60 a megawatt hour price, you will be in the money. You'll be comparable to wind and solar, and we can keep the plant running. Well, that didn't happen. or actually the wind purchase agreements were at $15 to $20 a megawatt hour, so the bar changed and the plant closed down. Well, now we're getting to the point here where it sounds like coal and other solid fuel that could be in the money around $60 a megawatt hour, and that's across the country. I've seen that in different plants that I've worked. But now all of a sudden, the solar is no longer at that value, so the coal and everything that's being taken off the line that could have operated at that level is now got this, these numbers are sounding really comparable. And then you also mentioned, this is for Tolu, you also mentioned the proximity of power plants, generation to end use. In San Antonio, Texas, when I worked down there in ERCOT, there was power plants that were literally the original power plants, gas plants and such, were right in the heart of the city because the city has continued to grow and expand and expand and expand. So they build the plant outside of the city, and then all of a sudden the city catches up to it in 15, 20 years, 30 years. How do we get people to switch? And I guess I'm pointing the finger a little bit here at the city people, because they seem to love the idea of wind and solar and all that stuff when it's out in North Dakota and being sent down to them, or when it's out here on all these farmers' land and it's being sent down to them, but they don't deal with the birds and they don't deal with the vibration, they don't deal with the aesthetics. So how do we get people who want these things to say, all right, well, yeah, I want it, so put it up in my backyard? Right? How do we change, and is there anything being done to try and mitigate that at all? Because we've got this rub of rural and city life that's driving a lot of these issues, I think.
Thanks. There's a lot to unpack in there. Derek, the property rights issue, I think that was directed to you. Do you want to answer that? Or? No.
I could offer some. I don't think there is an answer, but I'll.
Right.
I think you're letting me wade into that some, so I'll take a shot at it. Definitely, property rights is part of the challenge. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't think anyone has the answer about exactly how to balance that. A couple of things I would add to comments we've made that, again, to Charlie's question, I think to the degree you can build fewer lines bigger, to the degree you can build lines that allow for multiple, and we've done a lot of that in Minnesota, some of what Purdy talked about, I'll unpack some examples of that, where with one structure you can put two actual lines to get less impact on property rights. Those are important things to continue to do, but you still definitely need a permitting process that balances that. So you've heard me kind of emphasize, I think we need to figure out a way to, if you need to build something, that instead of not on planet Earth, you can get to a point where you can say, how do you reasonably go through a process to balance those things and still decide what you should build and what it should look like and where it should be built. And property rights are definitely part of what needs to continue to be balanced in all of that. And so it shouldn't take zero time because you have to work through those things. Another thing that does come to mind is this is part of the reason why I think we need a balanced approach to having a lot of different resources available. Distributed energy resources are already, DG local, smaller things at the home or close to the home are going to become more of a solution, I think, as we go forward, and there are some property rights advantages to that. Wind and solar take a lot of property. There has to be more wind and solar in the mix. There's just no way around that based on the way the world is going, whether you like it or not. But being able to capture carbon at bigger centralized plants as an option so that those plants that are already been built can put some carbon in the ground and you can keep those as a viable option could be a way to manage property right balancing in a reasonable way. So being able to keep, from a policy standpoint, solutions like carbon capture and sequestration on the table. Similar to that would be nuclear power. There's innovative approaches to doing small modular reactors instead of the big traditional nuclear power plants. That's another area where, again, I can't say whether to what degree that's the answer, but to be able to continue to innovate along those lines could be a way to help balance property rights, because again, even though we know we'll need more wind and solar, they are property intensive ways to get power compared to other alternatives probably. So those are some things that are going on that are trying to, you know, again, it's certainly one of the reasons that the industry has a lot of challenges to work through, because people, you know, own their property, and that's an important thing to continue to balance.
Well, for not wanting to answer that question, you certainly did.
That wasn't an answer.
Very good job. Now, the second question, and I think this also speaks in some ways to Julie's previous statements about privilege. You know, that idea that, you know, I don't want to see what I use, right? I don't want to see it. And so, Zach, one question was the cost and the changing economics of wind relative to other costs, other resources. And then for both, I guess, you and Tolu was the question of how do we change minds around where resources can be sited? Sure.
So I'll go. They gave me my microphone back, which usually doesn't happen when somebody takes it away. Great questions. I'll try and answer them briefly to leave time for others. If I don't answer them completely, see, they took it away again. If I don't answer it completely, we can talk afterwards. So very, very quickly, cost changes, yes, wind and solar costs are going up, but that's driven primarily by the supply chains and the commodity prices, so that means that the cost of everything else is going up too. So the cost of wind is increasing, solar is increasing, storage is increasing, the iron and the steel needed to build gas peaking plants, gas combined cycle, nuclear units. There's a nuclear small modular reactor demonstration project in Utah that's recently more than doubled in price out there too. So it's pervasive across the whole industry. You talked briefly about the profitability of fossil fuels and how that's changing decision making. We're seeing that happening with other utilities in this area. We're hearing conversations with folks like Xcel and Otter Tail and folks all over the country that are facing retirement decisions and the alternative investment opportunities that they have. Ultimately, the decisions that are made are driven by the revenues you can realize in the market versus the cost to offer those assets in. Right? So your bogey isn't anymore, if I can get down to $25, which is what solar is, that's what I'm going to go for instead, because they offer different characteristics and different benefits. At the end of the day, you want to try to invest in resources that are providing a decent return in revenue, that are satisfying what you need in your portfolio, but also we're riding this whipsaw in the markets right now that's driven by gas pricing. So as gas prices dictate electricity prices in the market, we've seen unprecedented volatility in the last 12 months in the gas markets, from prices today as low as they've been as far as I can remember in the $2-3 MMBTU region. And then last summer we were up at the $8-9. We were seeing 100% swings on gas prices within a 24-hour period, right? And that kind of volatility in the markets really makes decision making hard when you're making multi-decadal investment decisions. And especially when you're faced with the retirement of a resource that can provide baseload services to you. You know, is your long-term outlook $2 gas, or is it $6 gas? Is it $4 gas? So it makes those decisions really difficult. And that's why taking earlier action has been a good thing for us. But you know, certainly when you're looking at the offers in the markets and how those units are compensated, very different value propositions across the board.
Tolu, any thoughts on yes in my backyard?
Well, okay, I don't have the mic.
I think they're switching around in the back there.
Okay. All right, thank you. Yeah, so I think one thing I can say about that is number one, we have to combat misinformation, right? So you can go on the internet and find every crazy thing you want on there in terms of whatever is happening with renewable energy, you know, from wind and solar, in terms of, you know, wind causing maybe cancer or migraine or killing bears and all those kind of things. So obviously when people have those kind of information, you know, passed on to them by, you know, whatever source, it creates some level of, maybe anxiety, and then also be like, no, yeah, I don't want that in my backyard if it's going to kill me, right? So if we work on converting misinformation, which is part of what I did when I worked at the co-op in Indiana. So whenever we have these kind of gatherings, we're able to provide real scientific engineering facts, right, to our members, let them understand how some of these technologies actually work. So, and then also in addition to that, if we are sharing the benefits, right, with the communities, if they actually see, maybe a change in their electric bill by having this cheaper source of power. But if you have maybe a large-scale wind or solar in your community, and then, there's really no change on the bill, it doesn't benefit the members directly, then it's kind of harder to kind of like adopt those kind of things. And I think lastly, is to pretty much also just highlight some of the benefits, in terms of maybe job creation locally, because that's another thing. Once you generate energy, locally, it provides job to the community. And the members live in this community. So once you highlight those positive benefits that they can get from this renewable energy projects, then it's more than likely that they would accept those in the future.
Harold, first of all, I want to express my appreciation for everyone up in the panel. Wow, what a job, Tim. You've done a heck of a job here. Now we got the phone. I have a comment and then a question. In my comment, and I really appreciate what Mr. Moe said right away as the first speaker. He was very honest and transparent and put MISO and FERC and NERC right up there and said, folks, we're in a crisis. These are the top leaders in the electrical industry, and they clearly said we're heading for some potentially tough times. That was good to see right away, and now we're getting into solutions. But one of the things that I'd like to see as a potential amendment for all of these states that are pushing 2040s, 2050s, FERC said the reason we're in this crisis is that we're retiring coal and natural gas plants prematurely. Why on earth would you do that until you had your house in order? That, to me, is malpractice. So in that regard, let's go on our goal journey to 2040, 2050, but let's not retire these assets that we have until we've gone at least 10 years beyond that with no problems with this new solution. That would be a great service to us as Americans. So that's my comment there. And keep in mind that there's national security and safety risks as well for lots of folks. Okay, now my question, and Tim, maybe this is for you, because so many of our members enjoy off-peak rates. We take advantage of the good programs of Lake Region Electric and so forth, really appreciate it. But if we electrify everything and get rid of the natural gas stoves and everybody's driving an electric car, what on earth is going to happen to off-peak rates?
Well, we've got a lot of rate forecasts, and our rates at the local level are going to basically mirror the wholesale cost of power that comes to us from Great River Energy. When we look at those costs right now, and Zach, you probably work closer with those than I do, but I think there is some good news in there. You've talked today about, and you shared some pricing numbers about what you're seeing right now for the most recent power contracts we've entered into specifically for the long haul with wind. They're fixed prices. And so that helps us forecast, and all the forecasts we're looking at do indicate relative stability. Now, on the demand side, that's where it's going to get interesting, right? And if the EVs come, that's going to potentially be somewhat of a game changer on the demand side. We're a co-op that if things change on the off-peak rates, we're going to be impacted about as much as anybody, because that's been our bread and butter for decades at Lake Region. Like I said earlier, over half of our members have at least one off-peak program with us. So it's a big thing. We will work hard to keep our rates stable like we have in the past. But I know, Zach, help me out. I'm just going by the GRE forecast, because as I said earlier, we're just an adder. What we do in the distribution, in the overall rate structure, we're just kind of an adder for the distribution piece. And that 60 to 65% is the generation and transmission costs. But the latest forecasts we've seen are relatively stable going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's right. And I remember speaking earlier this year at the annual meeting, and we spoke about the rate increase. Obviously, it's a topic for everybody. That rate increase that GRE passed through is the first one that I believe that we've passed on in 5 years. And we don't have any more rate increases on the horizon right now. And that's primarily due to the early action that we took on the resources that we've added and removed from the portfolio, and it's put us in a position of stability for the next decade in terms of investments and new investments that we have to make. So, if you look around the state, you're seeing regulatory filings, and I think somebody spoke about it earlier with Xcel and Minnesota Power and others in the area, and not just in Minnesota, but all across the region, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Iowa as well. You're seeing requests for rate increases coming because people haven't taken a ton of proactive action. And that proactive action has allowed us to avoid some of the more significant impacts of these cost increases that we've seen. We don't project any rate increases associated with the power supply decisions of selling Coal Creek or retiring Stanton or adding the wind that we've added in the last 5 years. So we feel confident about that. On the transmission side of the business, Pretty's not here, but we do have a significant amount of transmission build coming. And so does everybody. But from the power supply side, we're very confident in where we are from a cost stability perspective for the next decade.
And I might just add, having dealt with a lot of these programs, that we've locked in these off-peak periods for years. And I think one of the things that we will have to look at is what is off-peak, because that off-peak period may change. And we're seeing this happen in areas of the country where, solar has taken off. And so the lowest price in some areas of the country, Southwest and California in particular, are right in the middle of the day when you have the most solar coming on the system. And so, one of the questions that we ask ourselves often is, what type of flexibility do we have in these loads to move them to different periods of the time that will be the new off-peak, so that we can take advantage of the arbitrage that exists within the changing resource mix that we have. And that's something that we're going to be mindful of, that it's not guaranteed that the off-peak prices are going to be from 11 to 7 or 10 to 6 overnight, but perhaps in other time frames. And we're going to have to continue to manage and look at what kind of changes need to be made to ensure that we're capturing the lowest cost of the day. There was a question right there.
Yeah, I heard a comment there was 60% of the energy generated as it's transmitted to end users lost. That's a striking number to me. So when we heard about the economic development potential of locally generated energy, that is a 60% cost advantage if I can generate it on my property or in my neighborhood. So I think we really have to look hard at that. We're in an agricultural region, an agroforestry region, tremendous amounts of biomass materials. If you look outside right now, or the last 48 hours, you'll see what the results of unmanaged biomass is. A tremendous amount of pollution out there. I don't know how many coal power plants would have to run for how many years to generate the smog. And the air pollution we're experiencing right now, your eyes still burn going outside. So I think what we have is an opportunity. Mother of invention is necessity, and we have a necessity to manage our local resources. We have forest fires and wildfires, grassland fires we're fighting this summer, probably more than we ever have. Those resources could be used proactively, made into electricity, thermal power. We have, 20% or less of the waste going to waste treatment plants or facilities bearing waste that could be burned and made into electrical energy. Talk about in the Twin Cities, they use a tremendous amount of energy, but they have a waste to power plant down there, consuming their local waste, putting it into power, and that hasn't go too far to benefit those people. So not my backyard is, well, what are you going to do with your waste? I think we're shipping a lot of our waste from this region to North Dakota, and we're paying them to get rid of it. So in Europe, I think there's countries where over 90% of their waste materials used for thermal and electric generation. We could be doing that locally. So I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen using our own local resources, our agricultural resources, byproducts from agriculture to benefit our environment. You harvest trees or you harvest the grassland, whether it's through livestock or forestry practices, you generate new growth, which captures a tremendous amount of carbon. So I need some clarification on carbon credits. We'd heard about this for a long time to farmers or forestry managers. When you pull carbon out of the air with plant material and you put it in the ground for long-term storage, can those credits be used to offset, what we need to do? The other factor is Canadians are innovative in this regard, but they're using hemp fiber to make windmill blades that are biodegradable or can be used for energy in the future rather than very expensive petrochemical, fiberglass, resin, so forth, which when the windmills are spent, or the blades are spent, they're going to hazardous waste disposal facilities. You grow hemp locally, you store a tremendous amount of carbon in the ground, multiple end uses for that material. So the whole thing is about our biomaterials, our bioresources, local energy production. I think we can do a lot here. So if there's anybody in the panel that could speak to some of those issues, I'd like to hear some of their thoughts.
I would say that one of the thoughts that I have is, what I'm hearing is you're talking about what is kind of called the circular economy, the circularity of how we use products, and where thinking about products from not just how do I make it and sell it and then forget about it, but how do I make it, sell it, and own the life cycle of that product. So I'm mindful of where is it going and how do we deal with it? What are the next steps in the phase of that product? Julie, you mentioned some of the some of the recycling challenges that we have, and how do we bring that perspective into the products that we're making, the vehicles, the materials. Do you have any thoughts on that? Not to put you on the spot, but
He's saying that. Mine's working. He's saying that because when he said my name, I looked panicked. At some point, humans need to just start figuring out this circular economy. You talk about waste, and so where I live, we have a local landfill. So we drive past where all of our waste goes. So we're very aware of what we're throwing away and where it's going. But we're also very aware that they aren't recycling much. So I worked on the landfill liner, and when I was working on that project, I spent a lot of time at the landfill, and I realized that I don't know why I was spending so much time recycling things, because I would just watch they would just watch it get thrown into the landfill because there was no market for it. And, I love being a part of this today because I don't think about energy enough. And like I said, I just take it for granted. And I don't necessarily think about the resources necessary. And we're not alone. And I just keep thinking of collaboration. How do we bring in different voices to talk about the circular economy and reuse? Where's the manufacturers? Because what is one of the reasons things don't get recycled? Because there's no purchase, nobody's purchasing those materials to recycle them. Or it's hard to permit a recycling facility. We talk about permitting. One of the recycling facilities in Minnesota is one of the reasons we had a big controversial air quality bill this year in the legislature, Northern Metals Recycling. So recycling's it's not easy either. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and we have to, as a society, step up, collaborate. Oh, that's almost going to be a Vanilla Ice song, but only a few of you are my generation to get that. Stop, collaborate, and listen. But we do need to do that. And when we talk about, I made a note to myself about hemp windmill blades. I didn't know that was a thing. And the more we talk about this, the better we're going to get, because we can't just keep filling up landfills or just throw everything in North Dakota, can we? Can we? I don't live in... I mean, it is big and flat. No, it's terrible. So it's that whole thing of what are the manufacturers doing to not only produce things including recycled material, how are they making it easier for us to get the material back to them to recycle? And are we permitting those facilities in America, or are we shipping all of our e-waste over to Africa and asking them to take care of it for us? So you guys mine it, we're going to use it, then we're going to send it back to you and ask you to recycle it in unpermitted, unsafe facilities. That seems really terrible. So long story short, we need to talk.
Thank you, Julie. Well said. We are at time. Tim, should we have another couple of questions? Or,
yeah.
But
A couple more if you have some.
there's one more right behind you, Steve, right there.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists for being here. Really appreciate it. My name is Hans. I have a question for Derek and Zach, kind of around nuclear. So Derek, you mentioned there's a moratorium on nuclear essentially in Minnesota. I'd like to hear more about that. Is there any efforts going forth to kind of remove that moratorium? And then Zach, how much at the long-term resource planning was nuclear looked at? To me, it seems like maybe I'm reading the room wrong, but there is an appetite for maybe even paying a little bit more for energy. I understand the small modular reactors may cost a little bit more, but it seems people are willing to pay that price for the increased reliability. It seems like a good compromise. It's very reliable and carbon-free.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is a moratorium on any new nuclear plants in the state of Minnesota that's been here for quite a while. I can't give you the exact year, but it's not a recent moratorium. There is some, I think, growing appetite for recognizing that nuclear is one of the innovative kind of approaches that we need to look at. And I say innovative not because the traditional nuclear has been around a long time, of course, but there's a number of kind of new ways of trying to tackle it. Small modular reactors, SMRs, are the ones that are the most commonly talked about, with the basic concept being, instead of building a big traditional nuclear plant that takes decades and 4 times the amount you thought it was going to cost to build, you build something that you can plop down that's a much smaller amount of megawatts, but still maybe 50 megawatt, still a reasonably sized plant. The regulatory aspects of that are a big hurdle that nationally, at the federal level, that are being worked on, that would need to be worked through as part of making that happen. I think there's some energy in Minnesota to looking at the nuclear moratorium and making some progress. There was a bill that in these last few days of the legislative session, it's still being figured out whether it will make it to final passage, but to at least do some study work around this idea and see if it could be moved forward. It looks like that's probably going to pass. What we've heard from some of the leadership in the legislature that aren't ready to reverse the moratorium now, but they have said, if there are ideas that you think are good, come and talk to us about them. So there are co-ops involved in trying to work on SMR as a potential solution, and looking forward to having those conversations to see if that can be part of the answer going forward.
Thanks, Derek. So, one quick way to answer that is we didn't have small modular reactors in the resource plan because we have a moratorium still, and so legally we cannot build one today. Now, we expect that to change over time as we have new technology and the costs come into more alignment, and certainly as we need to avert reliability challenges on the system. Personally, I'm a big fan of the properties that are provided by small modular reactor technology. It's small. It's got a very small footprint and environmental impact compared to large technology. It can even be mobile. It provides 24/7 baseload energy. It provides a firm capacity resource. No carbon emissions. What's not to like, really? There's a lot of changes happening in the nuclear industry. My group works with a number of different organizations. We've reached out and worked with New Scale Power, there's TerraPower, there's companies called Oklos, Westinghouse, obviously GE. These are all companies that are providing small modular reactor solutions, and they're doing so quickly and at scale because there is a market need for it. Earlier this year, I think in January, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States just approved NuScale's small modular reactor design application that they submitted in 2018. So we're starting to see regulatory boulders begin to move and budge, and as they do, and this technology becomes more mainstream, it really is a competitive technology that offers some really creative solutions as well. There's another company that I mentioned, TerraPower. It's a combined molten salt storage solution as well as nuclear power, and so it's capable of scaling the power output. So it's essentially storage with the nuclear that provides dispatch properties and characteristics that combine a coal plant and a natural gas peaking facility. So there's a lot of interesting things to like. We're excited about it. We're going to continue studying it. And it's certainly a part of the analysis that we do, just not in the outwardly facing regulatory filing in the IRP.
We'd really appreciate any feedback that you could give us on today's meeting. You know, we've talked about a lot of change, and things are changing rapidly as we've talked, but you know what? Maybe the most important thing hasn't changed, and that's what we're doing right here. We're coming together at the local level. We're communicating. We're interacting. I hope we've all learned something today. Fantastic questions and feedback. Thank you to all who asked the questions and had your comments. And I guess I just want to thank the team here again. Fantastic job. Really appreciate you being here today.
Right. Well, very good. Thank you all very much for your time and attention today. We'll be sticking around and happy to answer some questions if you have some. And have a great day, everyone.